right, greetings everybody, and welcome to Conflict Radio. It is Saturday, December 7th, 2024, and it's an interesting day today. I just realized the anniversary is December 7th, right? Yeah, that's Pearl Harbor Days today. It's Saturday. I didn't get a show out to you guys last night. Been really busy. It's a busy weekend here as we're getting ready for the holidays. Hopefully, this will be out tonight. I'll get it up. I'll get it out tonight. Sunday, hopefully there's just, hopefully we keep doing this. I want to do this every day, till we're all caught up, until we go through all of season one. This for everybody that's not a member. And I know some of you guys are enjoying listening to this stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and do it. Today, we're going to have a pretty cool episodes. I think we can have Robin Hood. Episode 43, we're going to talk about Robin Hood with Graham Phillips. Second episode is episode 62. It's Wild West Outlaws. We're going to talk about Billy the Kid and Wild Bill and Doc Holliday with Justin Rimmel. That's a really cool show. And another really good show I've got is episode 93, Black Flags, Blue Waters with Eric J. Dolan is the episode. This is about pirates, Captain William Kidd, Blackbeard, Henry Morgan. And so we're going to talk about Robin Hood, Outlaws, and Pirates. I mean, it's kind of our Outlaw Saturday. So hope you guys enjoy it. Stick around. Enjoy the show. These are meant to be, really long shows. You just hit play and go about your day. Hit play, leave the house, go do shopping. Hit play, lay down, go to sleep. That's what they're for. So I hope you guys are enjoying them. And give me a thumbs up. Make sure you thumbs up the video. And if you're not a subscriber, make sure you subscribe. We got season 3 coming early 2024. And we still have our season 2 finale is going to be next week with Laura Eisenhower. It's going to be, I'm recording the show on Tuesday, but I'm not going to go live with Laura Eisenhower. I think that's probably not good for fluff tubes. So I'm going to record it and make sure it's all good to go before we put it out there. But that's probably going to be Wednesday night, guys, to be honest with you. Probably put that out there at 6:30, 7:30 Eastern time, 6:30 Central time on Wednesday will be our season 2 finale. And then we're going to take a break till early 2024. So I hope you guys are enjoying these. I hope you guys are enjoying the holidays. Remember, my wife and I just watched a Christmas movie. I actually forced her to watch one. What did we watch? Hot Frosty on Netflix. It was actually pretty good. I mean, we enjoyed it. I had to, bend her arm a little bit to stay in the living room while I hit play. And she's not into the Christmas movies, but it helps bring about the Christmas spirit. And I think that's important. That everybody gets into the Christmas spirit, even if you're alone out there. It's still good to feel the holidays and feel the energy of it. It's always really good energy. At least I think so. So anyway, I guess we'll talk to you later. Enjoy the show. You're listening to Conflict Radio on the Conflict Radio Network. Greetings and welcome to Conflict Radio. Today is November 10th, 2020, and today we're going to be speaking with Graham Phillips. Graham Phillips has been described as a historical detective, a modern-day adventurer, and a real-life Indiana Jones. He has been one of Britain's best-selling nonfiction authors for over 20 years. In 1981, after working as a radio journalist and broadcaster for the BBC and editing a popular monthly magazine, he first turned his talents to investigating unsolved historical mysteries. He has since written 13 books, which are in print around the world and have been published in 10 different languages. You can check out his website, grahamphillips.net, and I'll leave a link below in the description. We're just going to cut right to it and talk to Graham Phillips right after this. We'll be right back on Conflict Radio. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. We've got Graham Phillips with us today. He is an author of many books, including his new book, Wisdom Keepers of Stonehenge. Graham, how are you today?
Very well, thank you very much.
Now, I wanted to talk to you and get you on the line because I've been hearing different stories about England removing Robin Hood's basically locations and sites from the world. What do you have to say about this?
Well, first, I better explain what's going on. Um, Robin Hood is obviously one of the most famous characters in English history, whether he existed or not, other than perhaps King Arthur. So any other country like Switzerland's got William Tell, and obviously in America they have Jesse James. I mean, any sites in these places associated with these historical or legendary figures kind of become tourist attractions. And in this country, the King Arthur sites, massive tourist attractions. We've got Tintagel Castle down in the southwest of England, where he's supposed to have been born. I mean, you go into the little village of Tintagel, you've got shops like the Merlin's Cave gift shops selling all sorts of Arthur paraphernalia. You've got an entire museum there to the Arthurian legend. You've got pubs named after him. You've got the castle itself, where he's supposed to be born, where droves of tourists go there every year. Every time the archaeologists find anything new, it's major news all around the world. You've got Glastonbury, where Arthur is supposed to have been buried. An entire town is dedicated to the Arthur legend. I mean, there's shops all along the high street, stores selling anything to do with King Arthur, New Age stuff. It's that's the King Arthur thing. And you would imagine that Robin Hood would be the same. Well, in the story, Robin Hood is associated with many different places in central England. The most famous, of course, is Nottingham, which is where the Sheriff of Nottingham is said to have come from, the man who holds jurisdiction on behalf of the king over Sherwood Forest in central England, where Robin is supposed to be an outlaw. And there was a visitor centre called the Robin Hood Visitor Centre, and it was like a mini Disney World. You had sort of rides and all sorts of exhibitions and models of figures in the Robin Hood costumes and all the rest of it. Well, suddenly a year or two ago, before the COVID outbreak, that just closed down. It's gone. Recently, I got an email from the people who run Nottingham Castle, which was basically just being used as a sort of city hall. But then they were going to be making it into a Robin Hood visitor centre. And they got in touch with me saying, could you help get involved in this because you've written a book about Robin Hood? And I said, yeah, sure. But then they said, oh, no, we're not getting any finance. Nobody wants it to go ahead. That's Nottingham. You've then got other places, like, for example, around where Robin was supposed to be born in a place called Loxley, which is about 40 miles to the west. And there was a pub called the Robin Hood Pub, which was supposed to be, it's basically in the middle of the village of Loxley. And lots of people went there. It was always very full on a Sunday, with people having their Sunday lunch there and taking their mothers there for Mother's Day and all that sort of thing. And then the last time I went there, a few weeks ago, in order to do some photographs for an idea about a Robin Hood article I was going to write, the pub had vanished. In fact, the whole thing had been knocked down. All that remained was a pile of rubble, surrounded by fencing. I thought, they've knocked it down. Apparently, a year or so ago, I didn't even know this, somebody on Christmas Day burnt it to the ground. There was arson. Nobody ever found out who did it, but it was burnt down. Presumably, they didn't have the money to get it rebuilt, and it was just knocked down and levelled. Near there was a well called Maid Marian's Well, which was supposed to be where Maid Marian had come from in that area. And it was like a holy well, a kind of wishing well, if you like. Mm-hmm. I discovered that had been filled in with concrete. And it went. But the most astonishing thing is that Robin Hood's grave, now, according to the story that was written in the Middle Ages.
Hang on. Before we get to his death, maybe we should, because I think Robin Hood was a real person, Robert Hood, right?
Yeah. Do you want me to say the historical research that I did to show that he really existed?
Yeah. We should back up for a second, and before we get to his gravesite, let's go through the legend versus the real story. What is the real story of Robin Hood?
Okay, well, I'd probably better start with the traditional legend firstly, just to so that people are aware of it who may not be too familiar with it, especially when every film that comes out has a different version of the story. The story of Robin Hood, the earliest accounts were in the form of ballads written in England during the Middle Ages. Now, they refer to Robin as being, he was a high, well, not exactly a lord, but he was a local yeoman, as they call them, a kind of low-ranking aristocrat called Robert of Huntingdon. And he was supposed to have been was made an outlaw. He crossed the king in some way, caused him to expel. Basically, he was thrown out of his land, and he was forced to live in Sherwood Forest under sentence of death if he ever came back. Now, when he's thrown into the forest, he then gathers around him a band of so-called merry men, which includes Friar Tuck, Little John, Will Scarlet, and of course, his lover, Maid Marian, all people who had been dispossessed. Now, the general idea of the story is that because England had not long been invaded by the French, the Normans, who had then ruled England, the Anglo-Saxons, the people who had lived in England before the Normans turned up, were basically reduced in status. They were either serfs or low-ranking aristocrats. And Robin and his men are all these Saxon English who are opposing the tyranny of the Norman aristocracy. So what they do in the forest is to rob the rich and then give to the poor, the people who are being oppressed by the Norman elite. And that's basically the story of Robin Hood we all know and love. Now, the oldest surviving story of Robin Hood is around about 1400, in the year 1400 AD. There clearly were others before that, because there are references found in history to the stories of Robin Hood, although none of these are known to survive, or at least if they do, we don't know where they are or what specifically they say. The story of Robin Hood is set at an unspecified time. It doesn't say who the king is. It doesn't say where exactly Robin came from originally, except for a place called Locksley. And Sherwood Forest was so big, I mean, it covered most of the middle of England. So there's many towns and villages that lay now in the area that was once Sherwood Forest. So it's not very specific about where he's from or exactly what time he lived. But at the time of Shakespeare in the 1500s, there was a playwright, a contemporary and friend of Shakespeare's called Anthony Munday, who decided to write a play about Robin Hood. And his story, he decided, I mean, we don't know why he decided to do this. If this was the original setting, who knows? But he set the story in the year around about 1190, when the King of England is King Richard. He was absent in the Crusades fighting the Saracens, and he left his brother King John to rule. Now, that's historically true. King John was a very unpopular prince regent, and then later a very unpopular king. And the Robin Hood and his men are said to be opposing the king in Sherwood Forest, and the Sheriff of Nottingham, who's basically the king's man in charge of Sherwood Forest, is forever hunting Robin, and he never manages to catch him. So Anthony Munday sends the story at that time, and the king is Richard, and Prince John is the person who's like the most evil character in the story. Now, that is the legend. Historically, did a figure called Robin Hood exist? Well, a few people have suggested he might have done, but some years ago now, it's got to be 20-odd years ago, I researched the story for a book I wrote called Robin Hood, the Man Behind the Myth, in which I looked into the various candidates for Robin Hood and tried to find out if there really was an historical figure, or was it just completely made up. The interesting point was that the first thing I found, I thought, well, let's go back to the earliest story, the one in written around 1400. It's a ballad called The Guest of Robin Hood. Guest actually doesn't mean anything to do with a person who comes and joins you for dinner. A guest is an old English word meaning a short tale. So it's called basically a short tale of Robin Hood. And it was clearly one of many that was around at the same time, although this is the earliest to survive. What's fascinating in this story is it does name the king, but the king isn't called Richard or even John, but Edward. Now, that's I thought was really weird. I mean, Britain had a number of kings called Edward, and I thought, now that's odd. So Anthony Munday decided it was King Richard was the king at the time, but clearly 150, 180 years earlier, somebody was writing about the king being a different king altogether. So which Edward? There's quite a few in English history. Well, the description of what happens in the story talks about Edward travelling around the north of England, visiting certain places to collect taxes. And there's only one king that actually did this specific route that's mentioned in the ballad, and that was Edward II in the year 1222. So if this, at least 180, 90 years before Anthony Munday wrote his story about Robin Hood, somebody was placing the story of Robin Hood over 100 years later. Sorry, no, not 12, 13, sorry, 1322. So it's 133 years after the period that Anthony Munday later places it. So I thought, well, no wonder if that's the case, no one's ever found a real Robin Hood, because they were all looking in the wrong time. And in fact, it seems they were looking in the wrong place, because the story, there are many Locksleys in England, and there's actually many places, or most places in England have all share the name with quite a few others, so it can get confusing sometimes. But everyone had thought the Locksley was one that was near Nottingham, which makes sense. But in this story, the earliest one that survives, Robin is placed north of Sherwood Forest, about 50 miles north of the Locksley near Nottingham, and near a place called Locksley in Yorkshire. Now, the Sheriff of Nottingham did have jurisdiction over that area, and the forest of Sherwood did stretch all the way up there. So the oldest story of King Arthur the oldest story of Robin Hood not only placed Robin Hood in a different time, but a different place. So it seems that I was going to be the first person to look for him where he really came from.
That had to be really exciting.
It was. I mean, the first thing I did was to go to the archaeological archives, the county archives of Yorkshire, which are kept at Leeds University. And I went there and searched through what they call manor rolls. Basically, these are scrolls, if you like, not books, but scrolls, written during the Middle Ages about everyday activities like who owes who money, what land belongs to what person, all the major things like that were going on at the time. And in the manor rolls for the period of 1322, I find that there is a character who is outlawed at exactly the time that Robin Hood is outlawed, and he's known as Robert Hode. Now, Hode, as it's spelled in the manor rolls, was the Middle English spelling of Hood, Hood, as we'd do it today. So he isn't Robert Hode, he's Robert Hood. And Robert, the name Robin, incidentally, was and still is a nickname for somebody called Robert. So Robert Hode actually is the same as Robin Hood. So you've got a Robin Hood who is, he was a minor landowner who was recorded in these manor rolls as hunting and owning land. Then he's outlawed. In other words, an outlaw is somebody, not so much like in America, like Jesse James, who's basically a bank robber. An outlaw was somebody who wasn't necessarily under a sentence of death, but they were thrown out the town and the village. And under the law, no one was allowed to help or feed them, so they had to just fend for themselves. So it's like being exiled, really.
Yeah.
Then once he starts to rob the rich and give to the poor, there's a death sentence on him. But all this is mentioned in these manor rolls. Robert Hode, Robin Hood, the outlaw, is sought for robbing certain people and an abbot and a lord, and it doesn't really talk so much about him giving the money to the poor, but it certainly talks about him robbing these people in exactly the right place and at exactly the right time for the first story of Robin Hood.
So, what was your reaction when you first discovered all of this stuff in the manor rolls?
Well, I was absolutely overjoyed, because for the first time, I think I'd actually discovered an actual historical figure who met the criteria. So, at the time when my book came out, I got a lot of publicity for it. People were kind of overjoyed that somebody had found Robin Hood, especially people of Yorkshire, who said, well, he came from up here and not Nottingham, where people had thought before, even though the Sheriff of Nottingham was after him. But then a lot of other people started coming up and saying, well, Robin Hood, Robert Hood, it was probably a fairly common name. He was an outlaw. Lots of people were outlawed. There's no proof that he knew anyone called Little John or Friar Tuck or anything like this. True, it seems that certainly Friar Tuck was a separate legend altogether that came from the south of England. There was legends of a renegade monk called Friar Tuck who robbed the rich and gave to the poor down in Sussex, which is in southern England, a couple of 100 miles away. It's doubtful as if the two people actually knew each other. They seem to be completely different periods of time. But as what happens, it happened with the Arthur legend. Over the centuries, different popular legends kind of got attached together. Like the story of Sir Lancelot was originally a French legend about a French knight called Lancelot that was later thrown into the King Arthur story to make it more popular. And it may be that Friar Tuck was added on to the story of Robin Hood. But there was a character mentioned in the manor rolls, a man called John Little. And John Little, according to the manor rolls, was a blacksmith who had arrived in that area, in the Loxley area, or what's now called Wakefield. He arrived in that area from a place called Hathersage. Now, Hathersage is about 30 miles to the west, and it's in the middle of the moorlands. And going there, I found in Hathersage churchyard, there was a grave saying, "Here lies Little John, the Lord Lieutenant of Robin Hood." And I'm thinking, wow, it's not an old grave, it's a Victorian one, but it certainly shows that in Hathersage, there was a tradition amongst the local people that Little John came from this area. I couldn't find anything else to prove that this Little John really was one and the same as the John Little that came from Hathersage mentioned in the manor rolls, but it seemed pretty likely. So Little John seems to have been an historical figure. So that was added on to the actual, to put that as well as Robin Hood or Robert Hood, and yet the evidence is building up. But the final thing to me that suggested that this has got to be our Robin Hood is the Sheriff of Nottingham at the time that Robert Hood was a outlaw, was a man called Henry de Fakenburg. Now, Henry de Fakenburg was also a minor royalty, if you like, a minor aristocrat, living in the very village that Robert Hood came from. And the manor rolls actually say that at one point they'd both mentioned together, Robert Hood and Henry de Fakenburg have been looking after the king's deer, basically, is what it said. In other words, they were both gamekeepers to start off with. Somehow, Robin Hood, we don't know why, is outlawed for doing something wrong. Henry de Fakenbury, on the other hand, or Fakenburg, or Fakenbury as he's sometimes called in the various manuscripts, goes on to do very well for himself and becomes Sheriff of Nottingham. So the fact that an outlaw called Robert Hood or Robin Hood was a friend and co-worker of the man who became the Sheriff of Nottingham is not only a bit sort of, wow, that's amazing, but it kind of may explain their rivalry. They were once friends and they both ended up on opposite sides of the law.
So what about Marion? Did we find anything on her?
Well, no, unfortunately not. The Robert Hoad of Wakefield was married to somebody called Maud. Sorry, no, not Maud. That's Matilda de Toothill. Toothill is another village quite close to where Locksley is. So he was married to somebody called Matilda, but he seems to have, when he was outlawed, there's no more mention of her. Whether she went with him or died or stayed behind, we don't know. But the name Marion was actually invented by Anthony Munday, the playwright in Shakespeare's time, who wrote the story that we know and love today. So she was a sort of invention. It's possible that Matilda is the real Marion, but the problem is, in the Middle Ages, women went virtually unrecorded. Unless you were a queen or something, nobody knows who you were, what you did, or anything. It's all, men owned all the property. Women, when they married, were virtually the property of the husband. So they don't really get a mention, apart from, in parish records concerning marriages or births. That's about it.
Yeah. So Robert Hood, how did he die? You were mentioning his grave.
Okay, now let's go back to the story. Now, I'm forgetting Anthony Munday's story now, the one we know and love today, which was basically an invention based on the earlier Robin Hood story written about 1592. Going back to 1400, when this oldest story of Robin Hood was written, it still survives in the British Library today. It's the story called The Guest of Robin Hood, or the short story of Robin Hood. In that story, he is outlawed. And again, we're not really told why he's outlawed, which is interesting. He then robs the rich, gives to the poor, etc., etc. There is then a break in the story. There's a number of damaged pages. So we don't really know what kind of happens from 1322 onwards, 1323. We've got about a year's worth of his activities. Then there's a break because there's damaged pages, they're missing. Then the story is taken up 22 years later. So approximately 1355. Is that 22 years later? No, 1340. 23, 33, 45. So the story is then taken up 22 years later.
Yeah,
the scenario is that Robin has been wounded and he's accompanied only by Little John. And Little John is trying to help the wounded Robin escape from whoever they're running from. They seek refuge at a place called Kirklees Priory. Now, Kirklees Priory, again, is in Yorkshire and only a few miles away from this Locksley where it seems he was born when he lived originally. The reason he takes him, a priory is like a small abbey. The reason he takes him to the priory is because the abbess, in other words, it's a nunnery. The abbess in charge, the Mother Superior, is Little John and Robin believe that she will help them as she is said to be his kin. In other words, related to him in some way. We're not told who she is, but she welcomes them and she says, yes, I will cure you. And she gives them something to drink, and she's treacherous because she decides she's going to, for some reason we're not given the background because that must have been in the pages that are missing. She poisons him. And while he's sort of ill and dying, she rushes off to get a man called Roger of Doncaster, who seems to be the sheriff in charge of that area, to come and claim his body or arrest him. Anyway, Robin, realizing that he's dying, asks Little John to bring him his bow and arrow, and he shoots an arrow from the window of Kirklees Priory and tells Little John to bury him where it lands. Now, Kirklees Priory is a real place. It still exists today. The gatehouse of the priory still exists. If you go there and go about 500 yards to I think it's the southwest, you find yourself on a hill, on a kind of wooded hillside. And in amongst those trees, there lies what is believed to be Robin Hood's grave. Now, what it is now, it's basically a series of railings that were put up in the 19th century and a little wall surrounding a grave upon which is what is written, a Victorian inscription. Here lies Robin Hood, etc., etc., Robin Hood, etc., etc. Now, most people have always assumed that it was some kind of fake because it was only put there in the Victorian times. But it does seem that somebody had put the grave there in Victorian times because they thought that something that was there beforehand was actually Robin Hood's grave. And in fact, there was an earlier grave there around about 1500. A book was written by a man called William Camden, who was one of England's best historians at that time. And in this book, he includes a drawing made of the grave that was supposed to be Robin Hood's grave near Kirklees Priory in this woods. The one that supposedly was there before the Victorian one was shoved on top of it. And it basically shows a fairly simple gravestone with a cross on it. And on there it said, "Here lies Robert Hood." So certainly in 1500, there was a grave in exactly the place where Robin Hood's grave is supposed to be. And it's not there anymore because there's another one on top of it. But what's amazing is for something which is, the nearest you've got to a Robin Hood's grave, something you'd have thought, if it was in America, for example, would be part of a theme park, is literally overgrown and covered in brambles in the middle of a wood. And nobody goes there. It took me ages to find it. People had said locally, oh, yeah, there's a place there supposed to be Robin Hood's grave. I literally had to hack my way through undergrowth to get to it.
Now, how is the reaction to your findings? Is it accepted by, I guess, people in power in England? And like is it? Do they acknowledge that this was an actual person?
Yeah, I mean, I've had quite a few documentaries made about it. Every time somebody does a documentary about Robin Hood, they have me on. I mean, National Geographic did a whole program about it and had me there in the archives, actually showing them these manor rolls. So, yeah, it's basically accept. But the kind of attitude in this country is, well, so what?
Yeah, but I mean, they make tourist attractions in England for everything. Why would they ignore Robin Hood?
I don't know. And people have asked me this question over and over. In the last few weeks, I have been doing more research into Robin Hood because just before we went back into lockdown, we're in lockdown again now because of COVID. But there was a period of a couple of months over the summer where I was able to go around and do some investigation, looking into the Robin Hood sites around the area of Loxley. There's a chapel where he is said to have married Maid Marian. And it's a ruin and it's got a castle around it. It's completely deserted, this place. I went up there, nobody's around. Suddenly, some guy comes out of nowhere. I don't know where he came from. He's just sort of there. I mean, this isn't, middle of nowhere. He said, oh, you can't come round here. You can't take photographs here. I said, why? It's just an old ruin. He said, no, you can't come here. And they just kicked. I said, well, do you know this is associated with Robin Hood? Yeah, we know. Yeah. So he threw me out. I then, at the same time, discovered that Maid Marian's well had been concreted in, that this pub had been completely... I mean, not only was this Robin Hood pub named after Robin Hood, it dates from the period that, from the Middle Ages. And according to the legend, it's where Robin Hood and his merry men drank. Gone. There's another castle just down the road called Chartley Castle. And that's a ruin on a hill. It's been open for years. You can just wander around it. That's associated with the Robin Hood story. He's supposed to have hidden there. I wanted to go up there. The whole place is surrounded by barbed wire now. They don't want you going anywhere near it. All this has happened relatively recently. And, it's just astonishing that then the final straw was when I read in the news that the Robin Hood's grave up in Yorkshire, the one that's near Kirklees Priory, rather than somebody deciding, let's sort of tidy it all up and open it up to people or protect it, they're going to completely get rid of the whole thing, chop down the forest and build a housing estate. They're building new houses on it, modern houses. I mean, what? I don't understand it. It's really bizarre.
I mean, you think they'd at least want to, I mean, if they're going to build a house on top of it, they should at least move him somewhere, right? You think he's still there?
I mean, somebody actually is supposed to have dug up the bones and moved them in the 19th century, but I don't know if that's true or just a local legend.
What is that legend? Could you tell us that story?
Well, in the 19th century, the landowner, who seems to have been the one who's put the monument that's there today there, because the original stone that was depicted in the drawing made in around 1500 had been chipped away and gone and weathered away. So they were putting another, they were going to be putting they decided to put this other memorial there and surround it with a little wall and railings to stop people pulling it apart. But that's all fallen apart now. But before they did that, there's recorded that they did dig and they found quite a few bones there. But it's not recorded what they did with these bones. I've tried to actually organise, over 20 years ago when the book came out, to try and organise at least a geophysics scan of the area to see if there's actually anything underneath. Are there still bones there? And perhaps an archaeological dig, but couldn't get the permission from the landowners. They said, oh no, we don't want that. We don't want to attract people coming here onto our land. So they wouldn't have it.
Huh. So why the cover up? Why are they hiding everything? Why fill in the well? Why do all this?
I don't know. It's just bizarre. There's one place in this country that still performs an original Robin Hood pageant. In the Middle Ages, Robin Hood became, King Arthur became a story that was enjoyed by the nobles, by the aristocracy, because it involved kings and chivalry and so forth. But the ordinary people, the story of Robin Hood was much more popular, because obviously he stands for the people. Whereas Arthur has the sword Excalibur, and he's supposed to be the greatest swordsman, and he's invincible with his sword, which is an aristocrat's weapon. Robin has the weapon of an ordinary person, a longbow. And which is probably why, I mean, in the Arthur story, when Arthur is dying, he throws his sword into a lake, and the arm of the Lady of the Lake is supposed to come up and grab it and take it down into the crystal depths. And then Arthur is sailed across that lake to an island in the middle, Avalon, where he's buried. In the story of Robin Hood, he shoots his arrow, and then he asks to be buried where it lands. So there's kind of similar themes in it. Mm-hmm. But one for the aristocracy, the other for the peasants, if you like. But because most peasants couldn't read, whereas the story of Arthur was written in manuscripts, in romances, the story of Robin Hood was told in the form of by wandering minstrels, in the form of songs, and it was acted out in the form of mummers' plays, as they're called. It was local travelling minstrels would turn up, dress up as Friar Tuck, Little John, Robin Hood, and so forth, and they'd dance around, and people tended to think that these actors had some sort of magic, if you like, and if they performed their dances right around the village dressed as the Robin Hood figures, they'd have good crops that year. And there's still one place that performs it, a place called Abbots Bromley, which is not far from Loxley. And there they, every September, beginning of September, at the harvest time, what they do is some local people all dress up in characters from the Robin Hood story. There's even a Maid Marian, but she's a man dressed up as a woman. There's a character as the Sheriff of Nottingham. There's a little boy dressed as Robin Hood. And a lot of dancers who hold these massive great antlers on their heads that are supposed to be 1,000 years old and dance around. And they do from morning till night. They dance around the village, and there's a fair on, and there's all these stalls selling various things. And they do that every year. So that's still going. But I mean, I don't know if sort of next year, I mean, they couldn't do it this year because of COVID, but whether it will happen again next year, I don't know. Maybe they'll be stopped. But I mean, who's stopping and why it's being stopped? Is it a deliberate thing? Is it just some kind of, I can't see how it could be a deliberate thing. I mean, somebody going out and burning down Robin Hood's pub, filling in a well, telling people don't let people on your land, somehow stopping Nottingham City Council from opening a Robin Hood centre and closing the one they've got. I mean, if it's as mad as Trump's theories about conspiracies. That is.
Is there anything being done to try to save and preserve these locations?
Well, I was trying to get some people interested myself. I mean, there are Robin Hood societies and Robin Hood websites and things, and this Robin Hood Facebook Facebook groups. And a friend of mine on Facebook said, "Oh, do you mind if I go on and try and sort of save that? Do what you like." So he went on to a couple of these Robin Hood groups on Facebook. And they were all saying, "Oh, Graham Phillips is, oh no, we don't believe that." Well, he's found actual evidence. Well, no. They wouldn't have it. So then he went up, somebody else went on, not mentioning me. Okay, maybe they're a bit jealous that I've had a book published and they haven't. I don't know. But then they went on and said, shouldn't somebody be saving these Robin Hood sites? And the basic answer was, well, nobody really is interested in Robin Hood in this country, unfortunately. Well, can you do something about it? Well, what can we do?
Yeah. Well, you know, it just seems like a lot of history is going to be lost there, and that's a shame.
Well, it's not just the history. There's some really weird stuff about the Robin Hood story. When I was up there the other week, there's an actual hall, a place called Locksley Hall, which is now a school. But it used to be a manor house where Robin Hood is said to have lived before he was thrown off his lands. Behind there is a wood called, strangely, Long Walk. It's got a pathway that runs through the wood from where the school is, or just behind the school. It's a public footpath. You can go along it. And it's about, 300 yards long or something. And about, 100 yards wide, 50 to 100 yards wide. So it's not very big, this wood. But in there was supposed to be, well, it was, I've seen photographs of it, a stone kind of structure called Robin Hood's Folly. Now, I don't know how old it is. It looks medieval. It could be something that was put there in Victorian times. But I wanted to have a look at it. You know, what was it? Was it just somebody's summer house or something? So I started to wander through this wood, and I was actually did this live on Facebook so everyone could see what I was doing. Started wandering through this wood, and it just started to go on forever. And I seemed to be wandering through this wood, down the one path for about 15 minutes, and I should have been out in 5. It just seemed really odd that it should have taken so long to get out the other. And then when I came out the other end, I seemed to be in a completely different place, in the graveyard of Abbots Bromley, which has got to be 5 miles away. I thought, how could I have got here? And then I went back, I retraced my steps, and I couldn't find which paths I'd taken. I looked into the history of the wood and found out that Lord Tennyson, the poet in the 19th century, had stayed at Locksley Hall and written a whole series of poems about the Robin Hood legend there. And he also wrote about the Long Walk and said how people, it's called the Long Walk because people who go there expecting to walk it in like 5 or 6 minutes find they get lost in the wood, although it's impossible. And there's a legend about it. In fact, he was so inspired himself, Tennyson, he went into the wood himself, got lost, had some kind of vision about how people can overcome all sorts of evil, wrote this poem, and astonishingly, during the war, the end of the Second World War, both Churchill and Roosevelt had copies of this poem actually in their pockets when they met with Stalin to discuss how to beat Hitler. For some reason, it inspired them. I'm not quite sure why, because it doesn't really make any sense, this poem. So there's sort of a kind of mystical angle to some of this stuff. There's another place near there called Dove Bridge. It's a little village, and in the centre of this village, there's supposed to be the oldest tree in England. It's a yew tree in the churchyard, in the graveyard of the church. And it is said that, and this was a new one to me when I found this out, but it's been in the local legends there for years. Robin is supposed to have married another woman after Marion. Presumably she's dead, or he falls out with her or something. And he marries a woman, I think her name's Cassandra. Well, I'd never even heard this Cassandra thing before, but that's what the local legends say. The yew tree is massive. It spreads out all over the place. It's high, but it spreads wide as well, and it's all over the churchyard. And when I went there to sort of photograph it, suddenly all the sort of a cloud appeared over the top, and I was going live on Facebook at this time. This cloud appeared over the top of me. I mean, it really and it started raining, but just where I was, and that village. And there was lightning and everything. And the cloud was only about as high as the church steeple was above me, above the church steeple. And I thought, oh, that is so weird. Suddenly there was a bolt of lightning. All the cars' alarms started going in the village. And people started coming out their houses saying that all the electricity had fused out. Well, that happened on my visit there. I mean, that might be a coincidence, but the whole place seems to me to be somewhat magical.
Now, what do you think is there a legend behind magic and Robin Hood? Is there stories of that?
Well, not in the original stories, but there's a kind of, on the one hand, you've got these people, we don't really know, because anything to do with what peasant people were up to doesn't get recorded by the Norman elite of England during the Middle Ages. Their story goes untold, mainly apart from financial matters, as much as the story of women goes untold. So we don't really know. All we know is we know that there was many pageants, Robin Hood pageants would take place each year at harvest time, in the belief that somehow these Robin Hood dancers could make sure there would be a plentiful harvest. So it's just in September before the harvest, they would do this dance around the village, like I mentioned. But this would be happening in villages all over the country. It was considered to be like paganish, but the church didn't really mind. As long as people went to church and paid their taxes, that was all they really cared about. Whatever they did in their spare time was up to them. In fact, at Abbots Bromley, which is the last place to still perform this dance, the antlers they carry around them, there's 12 of them carry antlers around, dancing around the village with the other characters around them, the Robin Hood figures. The horn dancers, as they're called, these massive antlers, stag antlers, are actually kept for the rest of the year, hung up in the church, in the actual church itself. And at the end of when they dance around the village these days, they actually go to the church for the blessing from the priest. I've been there, I've seen it. They still do it today. One can only assume that this was how the other Robin Hood pageants were performed. So we can only go off what we've still got today. We know that this pageant was performed like all over the place, but we don't know the details except for what survives at Abbots Bromley. And there is clearly some belief that Robin Hood and his characters hold some sort of, I don't know, they're being used as part of some kind of fertility ritual, if you like, thinly disguised as Robin Hood. I mean, maybe there's more to it, that the church, if they dressed up as ancient gods, I mean, the church would not like that, but dressed up as friars and Maid Marian and things, well, that's fairly harmless. So that's maybe how they got away with it in the Middle Ages. But a few years ago now, there was a TV series that somebody put together about Robin Hood, in which Robin Hood is a very good series. It's actually just been reshown now on Amazon, called Robin of Sherwood, in which Robin and his outlaws are being portrayed as sort of not only warriors, but also in touch with some kind of supernatural force. And in fact, the character that seems to be behind their influence is a Saxon forest god called Herne the Hunter, who's basically a human being who goes off into a trance and puts a stag head, headdress on. Now, I remember a friend of mine did some research into this and asked the writer of this series where he got the idea to bring in Herne the Hunter into the story of Robin Hood. And he told him about some research he had done. And true enough, if you look back into some of the early engravings of the Robin Hood minstrels, the ones that turn up every September and do this dance, and in various places in the country where they no longer do it, and there's no actual description about what they did, but in those engravings, we see the Robin Hood figures, we see figures holding the antlers, and there's some other figure in front of them that's seemingly leading the whole thing is a man wearing a stag headdress. So it does seem that there's veneration of the old Saxon gods, or at least one old Saxon god, involved in the Robin Hood story. And by them dancing around the village, it brings the power of Herne the Hunter to make sure that the harvest is going to be fruitful.
That's fascinating. How long have they been doing these festivals?
Well, the one in Abbots Bromley is recorded as early as the early 1400s. So right almost from the time that the figure that I thought was Robin Hood actually existed. So pretty much since Robin Hood's time.
So the real story could actually have some, I guess, rituals that the church doesn't like.
My bet about the whole thing is this, and I think you're absolutely right. It starts off, there is a Robin Hood, he becomes an outlaw, he fights for injustice, fights against injustice. He starts a bit of a rebellion. The rebellion isn't properly recorded in English history because the Normans would not record it. They'd want it to be forgotten. He becomes a popular folk hero. At the same time, the Saxons in England, who are being ruled by the Normans, still worship their old gods, chief of whom may be Herne, the hunter. In the summer, they have one god. They have a goddess called Estra, after whom Easter is actually named. She's the goddess of the fertility, of the growing season, of the plants growing and the green trees. Then when it gets to the end of August, September comes and autumn begins, fall. In Saxon tradition, the goddess then, or a woman who plays the part of the goddess, somebody who a medium, if you like, who goes entranced and then speaks on behalf of the goddess, hands over to a man who becomes the master of ceremonies during the wintertime, who is the hunter god. In other words, there's nothing growing after the harvest. They've then got to rely on hunting animals in the forest. So therefore, this antler, stag-headed god becomes the chief god of the winter. Now, that was Saxon paganism. Saxons had become nominally Christian before the Normans turned up, and the leaders had been Christian for a long time. But it seems that many of the ordinary people remained at least nominally pagan, and the church kind of turned a bit of a blind eye to it, because in other words, well, let's for the sake of peace, let them do what they like as long as they come to church and put money in our collection plates. Then what happens is the Normans take over. They're much more fanatical Christian, and they say, right, no more of this pagan stuff going on. So somehow the story of Robin Hood, which becomes popular, and actors are going around performing a Robin Hood play, and they're invited to various festivals, including harvest festivals and things like that. What they do is people start adding the two things together. These fertility dancers, like these horn dancers, get involved in the Robin Hood pageant. And over a few years, the two stories, the pageant and the Robin Hood tales are told at the same time, are performed at the same time. And then, just as you said, in order to sort of like keep it from the church that there was really some quite serious intent to all this, they're using the Robin Hood story in order to perform these rituals. So in case some bishop turns up or something, so now they're just dancing around doing Robin Hood stuff. I mean, the local priest would know what was going on, no doubt, but to keep the peace, they'd say you can do it, but if the bishop turns up, you're just doing Robin Hood stuff, It's nothing to do with paganism. This has gone on for a long time, and now perhaps some people within the church or some Christian groups or fundamentalists may realize that there's too much paganism involved in the Robin Hood story and want to stop it.
It's almost like the truth is now coming out, so let's eliminate all of this stuff before it really comes out.
Yeah, I would say that's about it. That's probably the answer. Can't prove it, but certainly somebody is intending to stop all this stuff, and somebody with quite a lot of reach and power.
And there's nothing anybody can do to stop it. There's not an interest in stopping it, really.
Well, that's the other thing, because Robin Hood in this country has never really taken off in the way that King Arthur has. There's not enough vested interest. If loads of people owned stores and made loads of money about all this sort of stuff, then they might be able to do something. I mean, like the King Arthur story, Glastonbury, the place where Arthur is supposed to be buried, which is in the southwest of England. I mentioned about how the whole high street is full of stores, shops selling Arthurian stuff and crystals and New Age paraphernalia and occult stuff. And the two things that nobody seems to mind all that. In fact, Glastonbury became, from the 60s, such a big tourist attraction that they started doing the Glastonbury Festival, which is like a mini version of Woodstock, which is the biggest rock festival in Europe. And it happens every year. There's a fortune to be made, and no one's going to stop Arthur being paraded around, even if he does have occult associations with him. Well, somebody obviously is deciding that they don't want Robin Hood to join that sort of league, and he hasn't so far, and perhaps they can make sure he never does.
Yeah, and get rid of everything now.
Yeah.
That's too bad. You mentioned King Arthur tossing his sword. I remember reading somewhere about some kid finding a sword in that lake.
Yeah, there's a number of lakes that are actually supposed to be associated with the story of Arthur. The one that's the most popular is called Dosmary Pool, which is not far from Tintagel Castle, where Arthur is said to have been born, in Cornwall, in the far southwest of England. And it lies out in the middle of the moorlands, miles from absolutely anywhere. And it's not that big, really. Maybe it's 100 feet across or something. And it's not particularly deep. But some kids apparently claim to have found this sword there. I don't know what happened to it.
Yeah, I remember reading a story about a sword being found in a lake by some kid, and I guess that was the last I ever heard of it.
Yeah, I don't know. What happened to that, I don't know. I mean, my research into King Arthur really hasn't really concentrated on the legendary sites. It's concentrated more on the historical figure behind it, who seems to have come from a different area entirely. But that's another story.
Yeah. Now, is there any Robin Hood areas people can still go? Is it or is it all just? Are you barred from it all now?
Okay, there is something that people can see. And those will probably disappear now. Remember I said that before the current Robin Hood's grave was there was a stone with a cross on it with the name Robert Hood written on it.
Yeah.
That's referenced in the 19th century. And what we're told is that the local landowner had it taken away because people from the local area of visitors were coming there and chipping pieces off it because they wanted souvenirs. So he took it away, and in its place built the little shrine monument that's there today. What happened to this stone? Well, I managed to find out that it was in a museum. There was a Robin Hood museum along a coaching road in the late 1800s, not far away. And it's actually recorded as being there. There's actually a drawing of it, which shows it looking pretty much like it did in the drawing that was done in 1500. Except all the names, you couldn't read any names on it anymore, but the cross, an unusual looking cross was on it. Researching more, I found that disappeared from that little museum when it closed down around 1900. And a man by the name of Jacob Cove Jones bought it. Now, Jacob Cove Jones was a rich guy who came from Warwickshire in central England, not far from Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare came from. And what he did was he decided to preserve this little gravestone. And I thought, well, he was an antiquarian, but basically an antiquarian is kind of cross between an archaeologist and historian of the 19th century, a kind of amateur archaeologist and historian, a collector of curios and interesting things. He bought this or acquired it from the little museum that was closing down. So I went to his home, which happened to be in another of these places called Loxley. And I found out that Jacob Cove Jones was actually fascinated by the Robin Hood legend. And he was convinced that the Loxley in question was his Loxley. That's a third one. There's actually two more. There's five altogether. But his Loxley. He acquired this stone with this cross on it that had been the Robin Hood's grave marker. And I thought, what did he do with it? Cutting a long story short, it was and still is, actually he had it cemented into the wall of the little local church. And you go in there and there it is on the wall. It's actually, it looks like part of the wall. It's there. You can see Robin Hood's grave marker is on the wall in Loxley Church, which probably didn't have anything to do with the historical Robin Hood, but this guy in the around 1900 thought it did. And so this grave has been preserved, even if, whether he dug up any bones and placed them in the wall there, I don't know. We tried to do scanning of the wall, but because it's the thick stone, you can't do ground penetrating radar. The only way of finding out if there's anything there is to pull the thing apart. Of course, the vicar won't allow that. So, Loxley in Warwickshire, not far from Stratford-upon-Avon, you go into the little parish church, you go through the door on the way in, and it's just on your left as you go in the wall, the original Robin Hood's gravestone. And who knows, the bones of Robin Hood may either be buried beneath it or behind it.
Yeah, that's interesting, man. That makes you wonder, if they didn't move him and put the original marker right back above him.
Yeah, I mean, why move his stone without the bones?
Yeah.
And he's put it in a church. Why a church unless there's bones to be buried? But anyway, I probably have to leave that for someone else to research, because I don't have the influence to get the church to pull the place apart.
Yeah, well, you'll probably never get that, and that might be why they did it. Well, Graham, it certainly was a very interesting conversation. You want to tell everyone where they can find you?
Yes, well, my name is Graham Phillips. My website is grahamphillips.net. You go there on the first page, you will see all the books I've written, and then you click on any one of those and it will tell you all about the various books I've written, everything from The Ark of the Covenant, The Search for the Holy Grail, Robin Hood, King Arthur, The Secret Life of William Shakespeare, you name it. I've written about it sometime in my life, and you will find the links there to my YouTube channel, of which there's the whole documentaries I've made about Robin Hood. They're all up there. plus loads of other things. That's if you can find that on my website, or if you just look for Graham Phillips author, search for that on Google, and if you put YouTube Graham Phillips author, you'll find it. But first page of my website, grahamphillips.net, you'll find all my books, including the one I've been talking about, Robin Hood, The Man Beyond the Myth.
Awesome, and we certainly would like to get you on again to talk about the Templars and the Ark of the Covenant one day, if you wouldn't mind chatting with us again.
I'd be delighted.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and we'll be right back on Conflict Radio right after this. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. That was Graham Phillips. You know, hopefully something can be done to save these, I guess, landmarks of a very popular legend. It's a shame that, for whatever reason, they are being removed and destroyed. Well, that's going to do it for us. Remember, you can always find us online. Just go to www.conflictradio.net. You can find us on Apple, iTunes, and all of your normal podcast catchers. You can also find us on YouTube. Just search for the Conflict Radio, and you'll get a couple channels there you can subscribe to. And until next time, batten down the hatches and be safe. You're listening to Conflict Radio on the Conflict Radio Network. Greetings, and welcome to Conflict Radio. Today is January 18th, 2021, and we're going to have Justin Rimmel on the show today. Now, Justin is the host of Mysterious Circumstances. We've had him on our podcast here before. He's also the host of Blood and Dust podcast. That's where our show today will come in. I want to talk about the Wild West, something a little different than what we normally talk about here. So let's change it up a little bit and be back with Justin Rimmel right after this. Greetings, and welcome to Conflict Radio. Today I have with us Justin Rimmel, and Justin Rimmel is a host of Mysterious Circumstances podcast. He was our host back when we did episode 1, if you can believe that. Justin, it was a long time ago. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good, man, and looking back, that actually was a long time ago.
It was. It had to have been April or May or March or something. Yeah. I don't know. I know it was after the lockdown had happened. Have you been able to get out and get to work and do all the things you need to do to live your life?
Oh, yeah. I live in Indiana, man. We've been back open since, like, May. We have restrictions on, like, bars and restaurants, but I've been going back and forth to work the whole time, and, I mean, everything in Indiana has pretty much been open since last May.
Awesome, man. I wanted to get you on the show because we talked a little bit our last conversation about your Blood and Dust podcast, and that's kind of where I want to delve today into the Wild West Outlaws, to take a break from our normal UFO, encrypted, and consciousness studies and everything else, and let's just talk a little bit about the Old West. How's that sound?
It sounds great to me, man. It's one of my favorite topics.
Who is your favorite Wild West outlaw?
Oh, man. It's like picking a kid.
Yeah, well, I mean, we do that too, don't we?
Pretty much, yeah. Speaking of kids, though, honestly, I would probably, as much as it pains me, I would have to say Billy the Kid, just because his past and the context of who he is and who he was is just very, very deep, and there's a lot of things that people don't know about Billy the Kid, I guess, that make him a little bit different than the rest.
Well, let's get into him a little bit. Billy the Kid, I mean, William Barney, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah, Henry McCarty, man, he
and I lost you.
The mystery of his upbringing is probably one of the more intriguing things, because there's some people that can't even agree on where he was actually born, because of the fact that Pat Garrett literally wrote his autobiography after he supposedly killed him, and it's flawed. They can't even agree on his birthday. So the actual birthday for Billy the Kid Some people say they don't actually know what it is because the guy who wrote the book for Pat Garrett, the autobiography of Billy the Kid, there's a lot of people who assume that they didn't know his birthday. So the author of the book basically just said, well, here's my birthday, just put that in the book. And, there's so much back and forth about just his upbringing and his youth. And I mean, we do have like a lot of solid facts, but a lot of his younger life before he hit Indiana is a little bit mysterious. It's pretty shrouded in mystery.
All right. So, I mean, we've all seen the movie Young Guns, right? I'm sure you've seen it.
Oh, for sure.
How close is that?
I get asked that question a lot, and to be honest with you, between Young and great movies for anybody who hasn't seen those, I highly suggest them. Those I would say are probably 60 to 70. I mean, 70 is a little bit of a stretch, but they're two of the more accurate Hollywood movies that have been made about like a historical outlaw figure like Billy the Kid. So they are fairly accurate, surprisingly.
All right. And you said Young Guns and what other movie?
Young Guns 2.
Young Guns 2. So you think he survived?
I do. Because the only evidence to suggest, if you weigh evidence or lack of evidence for that matter, there's only 2 or 3 people in the world that say Billy the Kid died there that day, and that was Pat Garrett and 2 of the guys that were working for him at the time. And when they asked where they buried him, they're like, "Oh, we buried him in an unmarked grave." Like the whole shenanigan down there in New Mexico, where he's supposedly buried, where the gravestone says "Pals." He's not actually buried there. They said they buried him in an unmarked grave, and then there were some floods that went through that area. I can't remember exactly when. It was either the late 1800s or the early 1900s, and it's assumed that his bones were washed away when that flooding occurred.
All right. So what proof is there that he lived a longer life?
Well, I mean, you have Brushy Bill Roberts and you have John Miller, but it's not really. Well, I mean, you have an arrest warrant that was issued for him 3 months after he supposedly was killed. So, I mean, there's that. You also have, like I said, Brushy Bill and John Miller. Those are arguably the 2 people that could have been him. But it's more of a matter of lack of evidence that he was actually killed, because the whole narrative of him being killed comes from Pat Garrett. And a lot of people always, say, well, they were friends. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid weren't really friends. They were acquaintances because Billy used to go into a bar that, Pat Garrett was bartending at. That's how they originally met. Like, in Young Guns 2, the movie, it's portrayed as though they were really close friends, and then Pat Garrett ended up becoming sheriff and hunting him down, and that's definitely not the case. But it was basically literally no proof that he died other than someone's word.
All right.
They couldn't produce a body or anything.
Has anybody ever come forward to claim to be Billy the Kid?
Oh yeah, Brushy Bill Roberts and John Miller.
So there are 2 of them.
Yeah, definitely. John Miller's the more low-key one, which, in all honesty, as much and the best part is I'm actually interviewing a guy tomorrow who wrote a book about Brushy Bill Roberts being Billy the Kid, and I'm gonna have fun with that guy, But I like to lean more towards John Miller, and it's not because Brushy Bill isn't credible, but John Miller, just there's a mystique about the guy and the stories that were told in the town he was from. And when he passed away, supposedly there was a trunk of his belongings that magically disappeared and nobody's ever seen. And supposedly that trunk contained the evidence that, he was Billy the Kid. He had all the same gunshot wounds. He magically appeared about a month and a half after Billy was killed. Uh, and he was recuperating from a gunshot wound that supposedly was the gunshot wound that quote unquote killed Billy the Kid. Like, he was never even in existence until 6 weeks after Billy the Kid died, whereas Brushy Bill Roberts himself actually had a very extraordinary life. And there's a lot of people that they'll go back and forth and say, well, why would Brushy Bill Roberts come forward when he has his own extraordinary life? I mean, Brushy Bill Roberts was a Rough Rider. There's photographic evidence of that. And he was in, Wild Bill's Wild West show. I mean, the dude he was legit. So everybody's like, well, why would he need to fake being Billy the Kid, when he has his own crazy ass life that he accomplished so much in? But in the same breath, Brushy Bill Roberts is a very, very convincing guy, because when he came about, he didn't go looking for anything. He was tracked down. He was tracked down by a lawyer. I can't recall his name right off the top of my head, but it all came about when basically there was evidence that an outlaw that he used to run with when he was younger, he was in a gang, and it was super crazy outlaw gang. Billy the Kid was riding with them when he was about 17, 18 years old, and he was obviously the youngest member, but supposedly this guy pops up in Florida because of a land dispute and an inheritance. And that brought about this lawyer. He went to Florida to basically verify this other guy's identity, and he brought up Billy the Kid. He's like, oh, you knew Billy the Kid, shot by Pat Garrett. And this dude stone cold looks at him. He's like, Billy the Kid didn't die, man. Billy the Kid didn't die. He's like, here's his name. You can find him right here in Texas. So this this lawyer actually went and tracked this guy down, and he was basically I can't remember. He was just poor, lived in a shack in the middle of the desert, eating potatoes every day, and he brought it up. He's like, I heard you're Billy the Kid, and Brushy Bill Roberts denied it several times, until the lawyer brought up the fact of his pardon that he was promised by Lew Wallace. And you can see those in if you watch Young Guns Part 2. That's basically the basis of the movie, is Billy the Kid wants his pardon because of the Lincoln County Wars, which was a whole huge, deep scenario. It was a cattle war, but it was also a merchant war. And that's basically how Billy the Kid even got started. I mean, there was a war, and there were over, I think, right about 65 to 70 people killed during the time of the Lincoln County War. And Billy the Kid was the only one brought to be prosecuted, and he was supposedly guaranteed a pardon. So when the lawyer met with Brushy Bill Roberts, he brought that up. He's like, how come did you really get a pardon? That's when Brushy Bill Roberts was like, okay, I am William Bonney, also known as Henry McCarty, and he's like, I want my pardon. So that's honestly the whole entire basis for the movie. The Young Guns Part 2 is whether or not Brushy Bill Roberts really was Billy the Kid. And the amount of evidence that corroborates his stories is overwhelming. It is literally overwhelming. He went back to Lincoln County with that lawyer back in the late 40s, early 50s after he was found out. And I mean, unless there was somebody locked up in that old jail, 60 years prior to that, you wouldn't there's no way anybody could have known that information. Like, it's one of those scenarios where if he wasn't Billy the Kid, he was really, really good friends with him, and he knew everything about the guy. It's super, super deep and super intriguing.
But you don't think he was Billy the Kid?
It's a toss up for me. I like to lean more towards John Miller just because of he was very discreet, and Billy the Kid, movies and all that crap aside, Billy the Kid was very, very good with two pistols. I mean, the dude could shoot. He could do a lot of things with those pistols. He was super fast, and John Miller actually fits his personality type a little bit better than Brushy Bill does, because Brushy Bill, being Billy the Kid after being Billy the Kid, lived in secrecy and then went and joined the Rough Riders and then went and joined the Wild West show and all this stuff. And that, to me, for a guy who faked his own death, just doesn't fit the personality type, I guess. And, you'll hear a lot of, contradictory arguments about, well, Billy loved the fame. He loved the attention. And that's not true. The papers loved Billy. The comic books, the little nickel or the penny, comic books, they loved Billy the Kid. He didn't ever want that attention. All he wanted was justice, and he wanted his pardon.
All right. Well, and he got it, right?
Technically, no. Even after Brushy Bill went to get his pardon, he went and talked to the governor. He literally did. He lawyered up. He had that lawyer with him, and they arranged a meeting to actually talk about his pardon. And the governor at the time didn't want to be the guy who pardoned Billy the Kid, so they refused it. And even Brushy Bill at the time, when he first went to the courthouse, the very first time they were sitting in a diner, and he told his lawyer, he's like, listen, I don't want anybody to know about this. Like, I don't want the news to know, no newspaper people, nothing. I just want to meet with the governor. I want my pardon. That was promised to me. And obviously somebody alerted the media. So when Brushy Bill went in, I believe it was for his second meeting, because the first time he went in there, he had to sit down in a room with friends of Billy the Kid, like still living friends, and he had to sit down with the descendants of the Garrett family as well, which the Garrett family obviously is biased, and I'm not trying to be mean or show my bias when saying that, but that's their only claim to fame. You know what I mean? It's kind of odd when you get into the Garrett family and the lack of evidence that he actually was killed by Pat Garrett. But he had several lifelong friends that confirmed his identity, stories. He spoke fluent Spanish. It was literally all the same things, and Brushy Bill sat down there and for hours just got grilled. And when he left, all of his friends were like, that's definitely him. The only people who didn't think it was him were the Garrett family. So you have that scenario. Now, the second time he went to meet with the government officials and the media and stuff, he actually ended up dying of a heart attack. While all that was going on, he was walking to his mailbox one day, I believe, when he died of a heart attack. And they never got that second meeting.
Huh, that's interesting.
It's really interesting, honestly, and it's so deep. I know I'm I know the listeners right now are like, the hell is this guy talking about? He got this fact wrong. He got that fact wrong. Listen, I recorded that episode about 2.5 years ago, so cut me some slack, all right? But if you take the time to look into it yourself, or even I did a 3-part series on it, and it's just I did that series on mysterious circumstances, but it's just so intriguing because, like I said, when you actually weigh percentages and weigh evidence compared to lack of evidence, I do not believe for a second that he was killed by Pat Garrett. Pat Garrett needed a body. Pat Garrett needed a body because he had already killed two men that were supposed to be Billy the Kid. And after the second one, I mean, they told him, they're like, dude, you cannot do that again. Like, you keep killing the wrong guy saying it's Billy the Kid, and well, just imagine what would have happened if Pat Garrett would have done that a third time. He would have been defamed. He would have not received his reward. He needed that reward because Pat Garrett he had a gambling problem. Very, very bad gambling problem. He owed people money. He needed that reward money. So what better way to say, oh, well, I saw a shadowy figure walking in through the doorway. Literally all you could see was the outline from the moonlight. And I took a shot, and it was Billy the Kid. And I mean, even one of the guys that was with Pat Garrett on his side was like, oh, shit, man, like, that's not him. And, the next day, Pat Garrett's like, oh, I killed him. These guys confirmed it. We went ahead and buried the body in an unmarked grave. Give me my reward money. And actually, the first time he went for his reward money, it was refuted. Like, they wouldn't give it to him because he didn't have enough proof that he killed him. And he ended up going back a second time, and then they actually gave it to him the second time.
Huh. All right. So let's move on and talk about one of my favorites, if you don't mind.
Okay. No, of course, man.
And that's Aces and Eights.
Oh, man. Wild Bill. Yeah, I can honestly say I don't have too much knowledge on Wild Bill. He will be an upcoming episode on Blood and Dust. I can guarantee you that. But one of the things I find really interesting about Wild Bill that's super cool is his relationship with Calamity Jane. That was pretty awesome. I think that was pretty wild. But I can honestly say I do not have too much knowledge on Wild Bill. I do know he was an amazing shot, and I do know by the end he couldn't see very well. That's about the only things I really know about Wild Bill.
Now, a lot of the Wild Bill stuff, like I guess the bar he was even shot at and everything else, is still there in Deadwood today, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. One of our co-hosts. I have 2 co-hosts on Blood and Dust, and Julie's actually been there because she's an absolute nut for the Wild West, and she actually lives right outside of Northfield, where Jesse James, they had that failed robbery attempt where Cole Younger ended up getting like 20 years. He served 20 years in that prison there. But yeah, it's still there, man. Still there, from what I understand.
Yeah, I find that show, Deadwood on HBO, is awesome. If nobody's seen it, get on HBO or wherever you got to go to watch it, because it's awesome. Have you seen that?
I've heard that. I've heard it. I haven't taken the time to sit down and watch it because I'm one of them people. Like, if I get into a show, I'm gonna get into it. I'm gonna binge it bad.
Yeah, it is one of those that you're gonna just go through in a matter of days. I think there's only 3 seasons, and then they just did a 2-hour movie, I guess, on HBO 20 years later or something that kind of tied it all up. And I guess the movie that they did to tie everything up was, I guess people haven't been saying good things about it, but I really enjoyed it. They didn't have to do it at all, so that was pretty neat.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So anyway, I guess that's getting off your topic a little bit. All right, so sure. Wild Bill and Calamity Jane and Deadwood. I think what makes Deadwood and Wild Bill and all of that so attractive is that everything is still there.
Exactly.
I think
Same
that's.
with Tombstone too.
Oh, Tombstone is as well.
Yeah, I've actually been there.
Well,
It's pretty awesome.
let's talk a little bit about Tombstone and Doc Holliday. You've been there?
Yeah, yeah. I went to Tombstone. It's still intact, and I mean, obviously, it's a tourist trap, but
I'm
they've
sure.
kept it for the most part intact.
See OK Corral still there?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. They have you know, it's not a festival, but you can go there and watch a recreation of the shootout. Which I mean, it's the shootout. Literally happened in about I think 12 to 13 seconds. Um, I mean, it's an amazing thing. I actually on Mysterious Circumstances did episodes on Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, and they, I mean, that was a sticky situation. Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp and Morgan Earp were actually put on trial for first-degree murder after that.
Well, let's talk about it a little bit. Let's back up. What all transpired there? Can you start from the beginning and kind of walk us through it?
Well, Doc Holliday's a little bit of an instigator. That's how that happened. The movie Tombstone depicts him almost almost perfectly because he was given a death sentence when he was 21 or 22 years old, and he got tuberculosis, and they straight up told him, they're like, hey, if you move to a drier climate, you maybe got 2 years to live, and he lived another 16 years after that. So his whole thing was he knew he was very good with numbers and he was very good with cards. So he knew how to gamble. And he wasn't a very accurate shot, but he was very, very fast because the pistols that he carried were lighter and had shorter barrels. So he could quick draw anybody, but his accuracy was just atrocious. So basically what happened was with the Cowboys and Ike Clanton, there was a little bit of a war going on because Ike Clanton's dad was killed, presumably by Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp. And the Cowboys and Ike Clanton knew that. And how that all happened was they were stealing cattle from Mexico and bringing it over across the border and selling it. And I mean, it was highly illegal. The Mexican government, like their low grade military, actually got involved at one point in time, and that's when Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday got involved. Now, there's a lot of back and forth about whether Doc Holliday was actually there, but Doc always claimed that he was the one that killed Ike Clanton's dad. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. All we know is that he used that to stoke the fire of Ike Clanton. Like, they were in a bar one night. The night before the shootout of the OK Corral, they were in a bar. And Ike Clanton got into an argument with Doc Holliday. They were up at the bar and they were eating some food. There was a bunch of guys in there. And Ike Clanton looked at Doc Holliday and said, "You know what? I should shoot you dead right here." Well, there was a rule or a law. You couldn't carry weapons in town, unless you were law enforcement. So Ike Clanton didn't have his pistols on him, and Doc Holliday, he straight up told him, he goes, well, go get your gun and do it. Like, come back here and shoot me. I'll be sitting here waiting for you. And Ike Clanton kind of, muffled around, and Doc Holliday, who was drunk at the time, looked at him and he kind of leaned over and whispered, and this was actually corroborated by two people, one of which was Morgan Earp and the other one was the guy who was the bartender. They corroborated the fact that Doc Holliday kind of leaned over and he's like, "I'll kill you just like I killed your old man." And he just looked at him and kind of smiled because, I mean, Doc Holliday wasn't scared to die because he was already going to die anyway, like really, really soon. So he basically, that's why you always see, in the movie where he just keeps egging people on. He's like, "Yeah, I'll have a gunfight with you right now. Like, let's do it." Because he didn't care. And that was legitimate fact. Like, that's how he went through the latter part of his life. And people were just put off by it. They're like, "Man, this guy's got a freaking death wish." And so they had that argument, and that's when Ike Clanton ended up, getting drunk the night before, that all night. I mean, he drank all night until the early morning hours, like 6, 7 a.m. in the morning. And then they had gotten word, Virgil Earp had gotten word that Ike Clanton and some of the cowboys had weapons, and they had their guns on them, and they were down, not technically at the OK Corral. It was actually, it was like an alleyway between two buildings, just down a little bit from the OK Corral. So Virgil Earp, Wyatt Earp, Morgan Earp, and Doc Holliday went down to disarm them. And basically, they went down there. There was a 13-second shootout. Several members of the Cowboys ended up dead. Ike Clanton lived, and what they didn't know was one of the other guys' brothers was a lawyer from Texas. So Ike Clanton basically went and filed murder charges. So the one dead guy's brother comes in from Texas. I can't remember his last name. It starts with an S right off the top of my head. He is portrayed in the movie, though. But that's the fun thing that people don't know is, like, there was a month-long trial afterward, and basically the defense or the prosecution was trying to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday had gone to the OK Corral knowing that they were going to kill those cowboys. And that's basically where they messed up. If I actually talked to a lawyer about this too. I sent her because you can find the documents online. You can find all the court transcripts. You can look through it all yourself online. It's really awesome to dig through that kind of stuff. But I sent that stuff to a lawyer, and she straight up told me, she's like, that's where they screwed up. She's like, they went for first-degree murder because of emotion. Because one of the dead guys who was shot, his brother was a lawyer, and he straight up said he was writing letters home. He's like, I'm going to get them. I'm going to make sure they hang, da-da-da-da-da. So they wouldn't go for anything less than first-degree murder. If they would have gone for either second-degree murder or I can't remember the other charge. I can't remember the other charge right off the top of my head. They would have probably been found guilty, and it would have changed the whole outlook of history as we know it. But instead, they went for first degree. They could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they went to the OK Corral to kill those guys. So that's how history played out.
So what eventually happened to Doc Holliday and the
Doc Holliday kept trucking along, man. He ended up going to Colorado. Him and a couple other guys, other guys that rode with Wyatt Earp on the Vendetta ride. I mean, they didn't even really like Doc Holliday. They just tolerated him because he was friends with Wyatt Earp, and they respected Wyatt. And but he ended up going to Colorado, and that's where he died. And that's where he's actually buried still.
Where in Colorado? Does he have a tombstone set up and everything?
Oh, yeah, he's definitely got a tombstone. I can't remember the name of the town right off the top of my head. It starts with a G.
Gunnison?
Yeah, that might be it. Yeah. That sounds about right.
And Herb actually went on to live a long life, right? Did he meet with John Wayne?
Yeah, he did, actually. When the Old West cowboy movies started getting made in the the 1920s, and the old spaghetti westerns and stuff, when those very first started getting made, Wyatt Earp was on the set, and he was basically a consultant, and they were making a movie about the OK Corral and the shootout and Doc Holliday, and he was a consultant. He's like, no, that's not how it happened. This is how it happened. This is, you guys are getting it wrong. Well, I think it was one of the prop guys, or just somebody on set, just a super low level person, ended up being John Wayne. So John Wayne actually met Wyatt Earp and had talked to him on more than one occasion on the sets of those movies.
You gotta love it, huh? I wonder what it was like for Wyatt Earp to, I guess, live that life where to see so much transition, right? You know, from the
Oh
old
God,
west
yeah,
to automobiles and movie making and all that stuff.
man. He lived a pretty hard life. I mean, dude, Wyatt Earp was almost hanged for stealing horses, and he ended up escaping jail with like I think it was at least one other dude, if not two. They ended up having to escape jail and went on the run. And that was right before he became a lawman in Dodge City.
Now, I'm sure that there were a lot of outlaws and gunslingers and people from those days who aren't so well known today, right?
Oh, most definitely, yeah.
That we've just put. Who would you say the most famous unknown outlaw is?
Oh man, I would, hmm, I would have to think about that one. I would probably have to say John Wesley Hardin.
All right. Who's
Sure.
that and what's his story?
Well, for lack of a for lack of a for lack of a better term, he was probably he was a huge piece of shit, man. He was a straight up killer. He was known as the gentleman killer, actually, and he started killing at a very young age. And this is down in Texas. He killed his first person when I think he was like 14. And I mean, he just kind of went on from there. But the interesting story about John Wesley Hardin is he did a lot of prison time, and he actually got a law degree while he was in there. And this was back in the 1800s. And he ended up getting freed, and he got shot down not long after he was released out of prison. But his escapades are ridiculous, man. I mean, the stories, just the stories. He was cold-blooded. And if you go anywhere around Texas, they know exactly who John Wesley Hardin is.
So, I suppose we should move on to Jesse James, right?
Oh, yeah, he's an interesting figure, man.
Wouldn't he be? I guess he would be like the last outlaw, right?
He pretty much, yeah. He a lot of people's vision or their perception of Jesse James is way off. Everybody thinks he was a racist that supported the Confederacy and just stole from the Unions because he was a racist Confederate, and that is not the case. His family, he was on a border state, and the border states at the time, right before the couple years before the Civil War started, those were the most dangerous places in the world because you can come home, one day and your family's hanging from, the rafters of your front porch because your neighbor on this side might be a Union sympathizer. Your neighbor on the other side might be a Confederate sympathizer. So it was all out, knock down, drag out war. And it was a lot of guerrilla groups. And it wasn't just the Confederates that had the guerrilla groups, which is how Jesse James, I mean, that's where he came to. That's why he was so good at robbing trains and robbing banks and stuff, because he had that guerrilla warfare training. He learned it from he learned it from Bloody Bill Anderson, who was an absolute psychopath. But unfortunately, he had his reasons for a lot of the stuff he did. But he took Jesse James under his wing when he was about 17. And I mean, a lot of people don't realize Jesse James had a brother that was half black. His dad had an affair with one of their slaves, and they had a brother. But the thing about it is they didn't treat their slaves like slaves. I know that sounds really weird to say now that I heard myself say it, but they would sit at the dinner table with the James family every night, to eat dinner. And when slavery was abolished, 6 out of their 8 actually stayed on. They didn't want to leave. And, the James family was like, all right, we'll just pay you then. And I mean, they treated them about as well as they could be treated. But yeah, I mean, even after slavery was abolished, literally 6 of them just didn't leave. They were like, well, I mean, we're pretty good here. And like I said, one of the younger kids was Jesse James's half brother. But Jesse James's whole thing was the Union militias that nobody likes to talk about. Everybody always talks about the horrible shit that the Confederate militias did. Nobody talks about the Union militias. And Jesse James, basically, he was I think about 16. He came home one day, and a Union militia had taken his stepdad, and basically what they were doing was they were torturing him, and they were trying to get information out of him about Jesse's older brother Frank, who was running with a guerrilla group, and Bloody Bill Anderson and all them dudes. So they started torturing his stepdad, and what they would do was they would hang him from a tree until he was almost unconscious, and then drop him back to the ground again, get him breathing. They'd beat him, and then they'd lift him back up into the tree with the rope around his neck again until he was almost unconscious. Then they'd drop him, let him catch his breath, beat him again, and they did this repeatedly to the point where Jesse James's stepfather actually suffered from brain damage because of it. Well, what they did, Jesse James was forced to watch all this, and when Jesse James kept trying to help, what they did was they took off his boots and they burned the bottom of his feet so he couldn't walk over and help. He literally just laid there and watched this happen. That's where his hatred for the Union Army came into play. That was the turning point in that dude's life, because after that, by the time he was 17 years old, he was involved in the Centralia Massacre, which is probably one of the most horrific events of the Civil War, and Jesse James was right there in the mix at 17 years old.
So what happened during that? What is the story of that?
The Centralia Massacre was it was Bloody Bill and Jesse James, and it was basically they were going from town to town and they were raiding towns and they were, pillaging and shit like that. Well, there was a train that had come into this town in Centralia, and the train, they found out, was basically bringing back Union troops, either for, a little bit of leave, or they had served their time and they were going back home. Well, the guerrilla group found out about that. So they go on the train, and like I said, Bloody Bill Anderson had his own qualms with the Union Army and what they had done to his sisters and his family. They had killed 2 of his sisters and maimed one permanently, and then killed his dad and his uncle. So, like, he was not a fan, but he was not. Bloody Bill Anderson was past the point of turning back. And so basically, Jesse James, at the age of 17, he's actually credited with killing a high-ranking, I think it was a major. I can't remember his name right off the top of my head. But basically, they took all these guys off the train, all the Union soldiers. They made them strip down. They lined them up, and they shot every single one of them. Just didn't even give a shit. They let one guy go. That was it. And they shot every single person right there, whatever the case was. Well, at that point in time, the Union Army had a troop of guys coming into town as well. And the guerrilla group, Jesse James, Bloody Bill, they found out about that. So because they were so trained in guerrilla warfare, they were great with camouflage. They were great at ambushing. They knew how to shoot, when to shoot, where to shoot. And one of the things about Jesse James, too, was he didn't really use a rifle. He had one. But what he did was he had about anywhere from 6 to 7 pistols hanging off of his neck, around ropes on his neck. And that's what made them so efficient, is because Jesse James is just rolling around, and most of the guys are just rolling around. And they're just unloading pistol shots while all these guys are taking time to reload and fire and everything like that. This dude just slings an empty pistol behind his back, pulls another one right there on his chest. He's got another 5-6 rounds. So they completely annihilated this Union troop. Annihilated them. But what they did afterward is what is cemented in history as gruesome, right? What they did, and this is literally documented Union medical records and military records. Jesse James and the rest of those guys, Bloody Bill included, they went around to every single person that they had killed. And this is over 100 people. And they took the butts of their guns, their rifles, whether it be a pistol or a rifle, and they bludgeoned all their faces beyond recognition. A lot of the guys had their ears, noses cut off. And what they did was they decapitated every single person and switched their heads with different bodies. And that is a quick overview of the Centralia massacre.
Wow.
It was brutal, man. It is the most horrific thing. And Jesse James is 17 years old, man, just rolling in it. I mean, any guy that was begging for his life that was still alive or wounded, they just walk right up to him and put a bullet in their head. Like, there was no qualms, no questions asked.
And how many trains in all did Jesse hit?
To be honest, I cannot remember right off the top of my head.
I mean, I'm sure there were a lot that were pinned on him that he probably had nothing to do with.
Yeah, and he actually wasn't even about that life. He after Centralia, and after the war ended, Jesse James actually went to surrender to the Union troops. And they basically said, all right, like, it was wartime. We understand. Like, just surrender and you'll be good. Well, Jesse James shows up and, he's carrying a white flag, and the Union troops shot him right off of his horse while he's carrying a white flag trying to surrender. And it went into his lung. He basically, the Union troops walked up to him afterward and said, pledge your allegiance to the Union or die. And he basically told them to go screw themselves, so they left him for dead. He ended up making it to the family member's house, and he was nursed back to health after, the Union troops tried to torture him a little bit, but he ended up, and that was another thing that instilled his deep-seated hatred for the Union. But when he got back home, he had met up with a couple of the younger boys, and Frank was already on that route. Frank was actually worse than Jesse was, and that's, a fact that a lot of people don't realize.
So did Jesse survive his death as well?
Honestly, oh man, I'm sounding like such a conspiracy nut job right now, but yeah, Frank Dalton was extremely convincing, and there's too much to talk about with Jesse and the reasons I believe that he faked his death. And I mean, I on Mysterious Circumstances, I did a 4-part series on it. That's how in detail you have to get. It's freaking insane, because you have the KGC that was involved as well, which was the Knights of the Golden Circle, which, for those of you who are like, oh, that's total horse crap, that's conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy theory. Like, it was a proven group of people. Like, it's literally proven, documented. And proving Jesse James was involved with the KGC is next to impossible. I could barely place the guy in the same. The only thing I did on the episode was I placed him in the same town as other KGC members who were confirmed and known to be in the KGC. And that was in Ohio. But it's nearly impossible to prove that kind of stuff. But Frank Dalton is a very, very convincing story. And it was corroborated by, there was one living person that was friends with Jesse, who went and confirmed his identity. I mean, the dude had the exact same scars on the bottom of his feet from getting burned. He had the same bullet holes, two in the same lung. You know, two bullet wounds in the same lung. There's a lot more. But it was funny because Frank James's son actually used to go around and discredit all the people that claimed to be Jesse James. He used to go around and claim to be Jesse James, and when it came to Frank Dalton, they offered Frank James's son, I mean, oodles of money just to meet the guy, just to disprove him, and he refused to meet with him. And that was like it's one of the factors that's included, but it's also, there's a lot of political relationships with Jesse James and a lot of people in Missouri, a lot of the higher ups politically. I mean, Frank James, okay, killed way more people than Jesse James. He was way more cold-blooded, way more savage. And after Jesse James died, he basically just went to the courthouse, turned in his gun, didn't do 1 day in jail. And it's very deep. It's very deep. But no, I do not believe that Jesse James was the one who was shot and killed that day.
All right. What about now? Did they ever find all of the gold that he stole?
No, they didn't. There's a lot of people that believe it's in North Mexico somewhere in northern Mexico, because there was a lot of Confederates after the Civil War that actually moved to northern Mexico, and there were ties with a couple of people of royalty from overseas that were coming in and out of Mexico with gold and shit like that. There were also trains going from Michigan clear down to the south that are said to have been filled with gold. And Jesse James himself, there's a lot of speculation that he does have a lot of gold hidden, or money for that matter. There has been a couple things found that is of a lot of interest, but proving it after 160 years is kind of hard. It's kind of hard.
So has anybody ever found some gold hidden away in caves in Missouri or Ohio, say, that they've been
Missouri,
able to trace back to?
Yeah. They can't trace it back to him, but it was a known hideout. Like, if you ask anybody locally around Missouri, because I've been to St. Joe, Missouri, beautiful area. And he used to hide out all around there. And I mean, it was a known place where he hid out, and that's confirmed by members of his gang who, eventually either got arrested or retired or whatever the case was. Even Frank James, confirmed some of the places where they would hide out and stuff like that. And there has been some stuff found, but actually tying it back to Jesse James is nearly impossible.
So it is possible that there's stuff still out there.
Absolutely, because when I did those episodes, I actually charted how much they had stolen, and I can't remember right off the top of my head, but for the life that he was living when he was supposedly killed, it does not amount to the money that he stole. It's, the fact that even his wife and his kids were taken care of afterward. They never really had to do much. They were taken care of by political party members that were supposedly involved with the KGC with Jesse James, and they supposedly knew where some money was hidden, along with Frank James.
Now, did Jesse James have any, ties with the Knights Templar?
That I could not say. The only ties I knew that he had was with the KGC, which, I mean, obviously not anything Knights Templar, but it's interesting in its own right. Just because, I mean, everybody says, well, Jesse James was robbing trains to fund the KGC and to fund the rising of the South for the second time, which might be partially true, but he was also looking out for himself and his family. But as for the Knights Templar, honestly, I never really read. In all my research, I researched him and the KGC for about 4 or 5 months, and did that big 4-part series. And in all honesty, I really didn't come across anything regarding the Knights Templar.
All right, because I guess a guest I've got coming up that says that he was very much involved with the Knights Templar. So I guess that'll be interesting to see what info he stumbled upon that you didn't find in 4 months.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see that info, actually, because I couldn't even prove that Jesse James was involved with the KGC. All I could do was prove that he knew people who were probably in it, and he was in the same place at the same time as known members of it. If you're referring to the Knights Templar, you're probably referring to what's his face? He was a prince that had come over to Mexico, and he was supposedly shot and killed by firing squad, but he lived, and Jesse and Frank James had hid him out and recuperated him, like nursed him back to health. And at that point in time, he basically owed the Jameses a favor, for saving his life and stuff like that. But I'm eager to see what he says, because KGC, yeah, totally plausible. Still no hard concrete evidence of that other than circumstantial, which sucks because I tried to put him as a member. I really did, but anything more than circumstantial, it's going to be hard to come by. So I'm actually eager to message me when you do that interview and have that show.
All right.
I'm to it.
There's I guess some Jesse James family members, I guess, that wrote a book even saying he's still alive, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's very much true, man. It's the evidence is overwhelming. And I mean, a lot of people discredited Frank Dalton because the dude literally walked into a newspaper one day and said, "Hey, I'm Jesse James." And everybody just, kind of was like, whatever, dude. And he's like, no, like, I'm ready to tell my story. Like, I don't have much time left. And he just poured his guts out. And I mean, it's his, the Dalton name, Dalton was his mother's maiden name. And it's wild, man. His ties to Kentucky and Texas and Missouri and even Virginia, and he had ties everywhere, man. It was insane.
So you think it was him? Absolutely,
yeah.
All right. So is there anybody that we're missing?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
All right. Well, you want to tell everybody where they can find you?
Yes, sir. You can find Mysterious Circumstances. You can find those Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Doc Holliday, and Wyatt Earp episodes on that podcast, and that's literally everywhere. You can type in Mysterious Circumstances podcast, listen on your favorite player, whatever you already have downloaded. I also do Blood and Dust, Wild West True Crime, which is getting ready to boot up again after very, very long hiatus. Basically in February, we're going to bludgeon our listeners with a lot of episodes. So that should be fun. But yeah, you can pretty much find me about anywhere. Just type in the names of the podcasts and you can listen on your favorite player.
Yeah, or go to 13 Stars Media on Spreaker, yes. And there's a list of them there as well. All of the links, by the way, will be in the description box below. Justin Rimmel, thank you very much for spending time with us today. We certainly appreciate having you on.
Dude, Mike, it's always a pleasure, man. I love coming on here and I love talking about this stuff. And oh man, so much deep stuff with Billy's past and Jesse James. I love talking about it, and There's just so much there, so much there. So if you guys want to go down those rabbit holes, you go right ahead. It's fun.
There's definitely plenty of rabbit holes there to go down. All right,
Yes,
we'll
sir.
be right back on Conflict Radio right after this. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. That was Justin Rimmel. Be sure to catch all his links in the description box below. His Mysterious Circumstances podcast is on ageofradio.org. You can go there and search for Mysterious Circumstances, and I'm sure you'll be able to find it. Remember, you can always find us online. Just go to www.conflictradio.net. Be sure to check us out on iTunes, Spreaker, and all of your normal podcast catchers. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow and get the word out about the show. Well, that'll do it for us today. Be sure to batten down the hatches and be safe. Greetings, everyone. Today is May 10th, 2021. Welcome to Conflict Radio. We have got Eric J. Dolan with us today. We're going to be talking about black flags, blue waters, and pirates. How is everybody doing today? Eric, you there?
I am here.
Man, I am so excited for the show. We've been working to get you on for a long time. Do you want to first tell everybody, I guess, who you are and what got you interested in pirates?
Okay. Well, my name's Eric J. Dolan. I only use my middle name for writing, but people call me Eric. And I've been... what?
Nothing. Go ahead.
And I've been a full-time writer since 2007. Before that, I had a whole bunch of different jobs. I always loved writing. I've written 14 books on a whole bunch of different topics. I wrote a book on the history of lighthouses, the history of whaling, the history of the fur trade, the China trade, a history of hurricanes, but Black Flags, Blue Waters, the epic history of America's most notorious pirates came out in, 2018. And its origin story... Excuse me, I have pretty bad allergies, so that's why I'm clearing my throat.
Yeah, I have to use Flonase before I do the show. It's brilliant. You have a ton of books here: A Furious Sky, a history of American lighthouses. I mean, we have got to have you come back on. If hopefully you enjoy our time with us, and it's not a complete waste of your time, so we can talk about some of this stuff. I would love to talk about the 500-year history of American hurricanes and a history of the American lighthouse. Absolutely fabulous stuff, and really curious. But go ahead. What got you so curious about pirates?
Well, I had just finished that book you mentioned on lighthouses, brilliant beacon, a history of the American lighthouse, and I was looking around for another book topic, and I had about 5 or 6 ideas that I was batting around, and I decided that I was going to ask my kids, my 2 kids who were teenagers at the time, what they thought of the different topics. And when I got to the idea of writing about pirates, both of them got really excited. Their eyes grew wide, and they said, "That's it, Dad. You've got to write a book about pirates." And they'd grown up on Pirates of the Caribbean, and all kids, everybody seems to love pirates, even though they're pretty nasty people if you look at them within historical context. But when my kids got excited about it, I decided that's what I was going to go for. But that's too simple of an answer, because writers can't just write whatever they want, unless they want to self-publish, I guess. So once I had the idea, I had to convince my literary agent that it was a good idea, and then I had to pitch it to my longtime publisher, which was W.W. Norton and Liveright, to see if they were interested. Unfortunately, all things fell into place. Everybody was interested in it, and I wrote the proposal, which sort of outlines what the book was going to encompass, and then I was off. I got a contract, and I spent about 18 months, 20 months researching and writing it, and then went through a year of editing process. When you go through a major publisher, people don't realize that things don't happen instantaneously. If you're a big celebrity and you've got a book that has a current events focus, publishers can move much faster. But for every one of my books, basically, from the moment I hand it in to my publisher, it takes almost a year for it to find its way into bookstores, because it goes through 3 different sets of editors, production team. It's a lot of work, but it makes for a good book in the end that looks nice and hopefully reads well. But so that's how I got onto pirates. I didn't grow up loving pirates. I enjoyed pirate movies. I certainly liked the first couple of the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. I didn't really like the later ones. They got a little bit too crazy. And I had seen other movies and about pirates, and it's just a neat topic. And when I was a little kid, I went to Disney World and went on that Pirates of the Caribbean cruise, the whatever you call it, the thing they have there. And I just thought it was a neat topic. And writing about it, the reason I really loved writing about it is not because pirates are inherently interesting, which they are. It's because the thing that really gets me excited is taking a topic and using it to tell a broader story about American history. And in writing this book, I just was blown away by all the information about how pirates affected colonial America, the interplay between the colonists and the pirates, and just the evolution of the colonies from the late 1600s through the 1720s was absolutely fascinating. And the interplay with the United Kingdom, or England at the time, Great Britain, it just was a fascinating story of how America evolved and how pirates played an important role, and often quite a damaging role, in that process.
You know, it's fascinating stuff, isn't it? I grew up in New Jersey, and of course we always have the, I guess the tale of the Jersey Devil there, but deep in the Pine Barrens there was a hidden town, a pirate town, if you will, that all of the pirates used to hang out and drink at. I mean, was it common for, I guess, the pirate ships to come in and they all kind of hung out together, or did they fight with each other at all?
Well, I don't know about that community you're mentioning. I've been in the Pine Barrens. When I was in college, my roommate, who later dropped out of college, he owned a beekeeping company, and he and I went down to the Pine Barrens once to pick up, with an 18-wheeler, to pick up tons of beehives that were pollinating all the blueberries, the high bush blueberries down there. But anyway, I'm not familiar with that story, but I've heard many stories about pirate rendezvous in different places, some of which have evidence, others which don't. But the only real places that pirates regularly resorted to that we know of were, one, Madagascar in the late 1600s, when the Red Sea men, the pirates that went over to the Indian Ocean and attacked Mughal shipping transiting between the Indian subcontinent and the Red Sea ports of Jeddah and Mocha. The pirates used to go to Madagascar, and there were women there, and they would hang out there and have a little pirate community. And then, of course, what your listeners are probably more familiar with, or what most people are more familiar with, is the Bahamas, Nassau and the island of Providence, where in the 17 teens, for a relatively short period of time, that was a pirate hideout and rendezvous. And if you see the TV show Black Sails, they represent that in a highly fictional format. But this thing on the Pine Barrens, I'm not familiar with that. There were other instances, short stories, like around Blackbeard's time, there were some pirates who would hang out near Ocracoke Island and other places along the North Carolina coast, come ashore occasionally, but there was no regular hangout other than those two. And when pirates did go to Madagascar or in the Bahamas, they often got along fairly well, but sometimes fights broke out, and there were problems and arguments over the disposition of wages. It's always a bad combination to have a bunch of pirates who are naturally somewhat ornery, hyped up kind of individuals drinking and around a lot of money. There was a tale in Madagascar, it's true, about some pirates gambling, and then they were trying to divide the spoils from a recent trip, and there was an argument, and they ultimately fought to the death. The two sides, I think 7 men on each side, decided to have a fight to the death, and ultimately all of them were slain, except for was it 1 or 2, I think, that survived, and they split the money. So it's not a good combination to have drinking, money, people that are outcasts from society, have many of which had, I think, anger issues, although they wouldn't use that term back then. But then again, there were pirates who got along. Sometimes pirates on an individual ship got along quite well, and pirates used to sail sometimes in the company of other ships and have mini armadas. And to do that, you had to have some level of communication and some level of trust with your fellow pirates.
All right. Well, let's get into some of these pirates. First off, let me give a shout out to everybody that is here so far in the chat room. We got Paul Beska here, Hugh Godarn. I don't know if I've ever said that right. Chuck Bam, Barry, John Clark, Blue Chicken, Tony Fradson is here. Let's see who else we got. The Happy Plague Doctor. Kingfish is here. Pink Chicken. Blue Chicken better watch out because Pink Chicken is in the house. And all right. So you mentioned Blackbeard. Can we get into him a little bit? Was he a captain of a ship? And I'm in all honesty, how did these guys just build ships themselves? Did they steal ships? Like Bluebeard or Blackbeard. How did he get a ship? And who was he?
Well, Blackbeard, there's a lot of mystery surrounding Blackbeard, as there is around a lot of pirates. No pirates, unfortunately, sat down and wrote their memoirs. Most of the information that we have about pirates comes from people that they plundered or pirates that were captured. There were trials, and there were a lot of times there were depositions that were taken and trial transcripts that provide incredibly valuable information about the pirates. But Blackbeard, or Edward Thatch, or That his last name, there are a variety of ways in which it's spelled. We don't know too much about his origins. Some people say he was born in England, others say Jamaica, others say North Carolina. There's no definitive proof of exactly where he came from. Other people say that he was a privateer during the Spanish War, the War of the Spanish Succession from 1702 to 1713, and once the war ended, like many privateers that were suddenly thrown out of work, he turned to piracy. That is certainly a conceivable story, but he sort of enters the history books in around 1714, 1715 when he shows up in the Caribbean. And how did he get his first boats? Like most pirates, they stole. they would start out small. The only pirate that of any note that we know of who built his own vessel, and we might get into him a little bit later, is a guy named Stede Bonnet, who was the man of means from Barbados who built his own pirate vessel. Well, Blackbeard probably started out with a small shallop or a pinnace or even a rowboat. Some pirates start out with rowboats, and they'd attack another larger vessel, and if they liked that vessel's sailing qualities, they would take that as their new pirate flagship. And then as they plundered more and more vessels, they sometimes would add to their fleet. And Blackbeard, ultimately, when he left the Caribbean for a cruise along the east coast of the colonies, his most famous cruise was when, in 1718, when he blockaded Charleston Harbor. He had 4, I think it was 5 actually, 5 ships, including the main one, Queen Anne's Revenge, which is a former French ship, La Concorde, a rather large ship, and he had other vessels and up to 400 men who blockaded Charleston Harbor for the better part of the week. They didn't really get much. They got about 1,500 pounds worth of money and a medicine chest, because as the theory goes, we're not 100% sure of this, but while Blackbeard and his men were in the Caribbean, they caroused with women and got various sexually transmitted diseases. And by the time they were up off Charleston, many of his men were quite sick, and they wanted medicine such as mercury, which was used at the time, to treat syphilis and other of these sexually transmitted diseases. So it was rather strange. A lot of people wonder about that, why he had the entire city of Charleston like under his gaze. He wasn't allowing any vessels in and out. Why didn't he demand more? And we can only speculate. Some people said, why didn't he go ashore and just take what he wanted? Well, there were quite a few people in Charleston at the time. There were a number of people who were able to fight men, and there were 100 cannons in Charleston's inner harbor that would have caused some problems to Blackbeard and his men had they actually gone into the harbor instead of staying a couple of miles off shore. But so Blackbeard, another interesting thing about Blackbeard is there was a book written in 1724 called The General History of Pirates, which is what was used for centuries thereafter to paint the image of Blackbeard, and it depicted him as this violent guy. And in reality, during the year and a half or 2 years that he was active, we have no record other than his final battle against British forces and one other instance where Blackbeard actually was violent towards anybody else. He was also depicted in this 1724 book as having 14 wives and prostituting them to many of his crewmen, which there's no evidence of that he was married at all. Some people say that he had a house in North Carolina, near Bath, North Carolina. There's no evidence of that either. But it painted a picture, a word picture of Blackbeard as this fearsome, incredibly successful pirate. He may very well have been fearsome in battle. We don't have a good record of it. He wasn't particularly successful. As far as we can make out, at the end of his career in November of 1718, he had not accumulated a huge amount of money, and he had quite a few other pirates under him. And any money they had would have been distributed relatively equally up to that point. So he was neither an incredibly successful pirate, nor was he an incredibly vicious pirate, but we have these pictures of him. And one other thing that Charles Johnson, who some people think was Daniel Defoe, who wrote this 1724 book, said was that Blackbeard would go into battle. He would have his hair sort of twirled around, and at the end of his hair he would tie these matches that he would light while he was going into battle, and the idea being that the smoke and flames coming from these lit matches would surround his face and make him even more fearsome than he otherwise would have been. Well, it's absolutely ridiculous. There's no record of him going into battle or attacking a ship with flames shooting out from under his cap. Think about how incredibly dangerous it would be to have flames coming out close to your hair while you're going into battle. But that's another image that we have of Blackbeard that really sticks in people's minds. But I can tell you one thing that's true about Blackbeard. He did have a black beard. There are eyewitness accounts saying that he was a tall, lanky man with a very long black beard that he would tie up in black ribbons. So at least his name is appropriate, if not his larger-than-life image that has come down to us through the centuries. But he has a fascinating story nonetheless.
Yeah, he sounds like a pretty interesting character. You know, I often wonder about the crew of I guess these ships. I mean, what are they just putting an ad in the paper for a pirate, or do you just like if you wanted to be a pirate, like what do you have to find a ship and go and you know talk to Blackbeard like, hey, I want a job?
No, well, at any port in the colonies, there are a lot of sailors, a lot of unemployed mariners, and they get to talking and they hatch a plan. Maybe they want to be pirates. They've heard stories about great wealth that's been obtained by pirates that went before them. Some of the stories are total baloney. But pirates are a lot like gamblers going into a casino. When you walk into a casino, you have high hopes, you're excited, the adrenaline's rushing, you think you're going to hit it big. most of them leave the casino having lost money, and that's exactly the same profile of most pirates. Most of them weren't incredibly successful. A few were, and those few stories of great success got people very excited. And keep in mind, at this time, the bottom rungs of society from which pirates were mostly culled, it was a very poor, a brutish existence. These were poor people. They didn't have many opportunities, and piracy could have looked quite attractive. So if you gather together a couple of guys, or maybe 10 or 20 guys that want to become pirates, the next thing is to get a ship. Maybe you steal a ship that's in the harbor, or there's this one pirate guy named Worley who started out in New York City. He grabbed a rowboat with 3 other guys. They attacked a small fishing vessel that was slightly bigger than the rowboat. They took it over. They transferred to that slightly bigger vessel, and then they kept going up the ladder over the next couple of months, getting larger and larger ships. And then they become a more fearsome fighting force. Another way that pirates get crew members is not by advertising, but when you capture another ship. Let's say that you're a pirate out there and you capture a merchant vessel that has on board 28 crewmen. You will immediately, as a pirate captain, especially if you need additional crewmen, which is something they always were in search of, you would ask the people, you'd say to the people on this merchant ship, how many of you will join us and sign the articles, the pirate code, and become pirates yourselves? And quite a few people who didn't necessarily have other great prospects waiting for them at home decided to become pirates. So that was one way that pirates augmented their crew. Another way was to force men to join. If people didn't step forward, but you absolutely needed additional crewmen on your pirate ship, you could just take the men, force them onto your ship, and sign the articles in their stead, or ultimately get them to sign them over time.
Wow.
So there are multiple ways that the pirate ships got their crews. People came from a lot of different directions, but once you were on the pirate ship and part of the crew, then your role in life, at least in the near-term future, was pretty well defined.
So how did the local law treat pirates? Was it kind of like the Italian mob, where they just kind of look the other way? They're paid off. They don't pay no attention, or were they like actively hunting these guys?
Well, it depends which time frame you're considering. And my book sort of is split into 2 different eras. Prior to 1700, most of the pirates, and I focused on America's pirates that came from the American colonies or operated off the American coast and in the Caribbean. So prior to 1700, most of the pirates were these so-called Red Sea men. During King William's War, when England was at war against France, one of the ways that you enhance your Navy's power during times of war back then was to hand out letters of marque to enable private individuals to send out their ships as privateers. Those privateers can attack the enemy of your enemy and bring those ships back into port and share in the spoils from the prize. So during King William's War, in the colonies, there were a number of colonial governors who handed out letters of marque to make these merchants privateers, their ships privateers, and they were supposed to go out and attack the French. But what happened is these privateering licenses were shams. They were total baloney. The governors knew it. They were basically giving the privateering commission to this captain or merchant and this crew, and instead of going to attack the French, they went around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean, where they attacked Mughal ships that weren't French but had a lot of money on board. And so they basically acted as pirates, and the colonial governors knew that these privateers were not actually going out after the French, but they were in collusion with the pirates because they charged for the letter of marque for the privateering commission. And then when the pirates came back, if they had been successful and they came back sailing into New York Harbor, for example, they would have to pay the governor perhaps 100 pieces of 8, each pirate, just to be allowed to land in New York and not be accosted by the local officials. So that's prior to 1700. The officials definitely looked the other way, and they benefited from it. And also the people, the colonists, benefited, because these pirates, these Red Sea men, were the fathers, brothers, and sons of the colonists themselves. They were going halfway around the world to attack these infidels, non-Christians, Muslims. That's how they were looked at that time. And they were stealing money from these quote-unquote infidels and bringing it back to the American colonies that were starved of currency. So people welcomed pirates with open arms. But then you shift fast forward to the 17 teens when you have the Pirates of the Caribbean pirates. That era is totally different. After the War of the Spanish Succession, the colonies were significantly more economically stable, and the pirates were no longer attacking these infidels halfway around the world. Instead, the piracy in the 17 teens was focused almost exclusively on English ships, and many of those English ships or British ships were American merchant vessels. So instead of attacking somebody else, these pirates were now attacking Americans. So of course, if your ox is being gored and you're being stolen from, you don't like these pirates anymore. So that's why everybody was basically against pirates in the 17 teens and early 1720s. The British government didn't like them because they were breaking the law and they were attacking merchant ships. The Americans didn't like them because they were causing havoc along the coast and they were stealing from the merchants who were the pillars of their communities. So that's when you had almost a worldwide manhunt for pirates, and there were nearly 400 pirates that were hanged in that short, about 6 or 7 year period, because everybody other than the pirates was united against the pirates. So it's really two very different time frames. And one of the most important things in understanding how history operates, and this is my view, but it's not unique to me, and it's common sense, you have to follow the money. Money is such an important motivating factor in the history of the world, and in particular in the history of America, the colonies, and the United States that followed, that unless you understand where the money is flowing, who's benefiting and who is not, you're going to have a tough time understanding people's motivations and truly understanding what's going on. And the simplest way to say it with respect to pirates is that prior to the 1700, the Americans were benefiting from piratical activities. So people loved the pirates, other than the British government, which didn't like the pirates. In the 17 teens, the Americans were not benefiting. They were getting screwed by the pirates. So they hated the pirates. Yeah. So they joined forces with the English government and Parliament, who had long been in opposition to pirates, and that made it much more difficult for the pirates to operate. And ultimately, at the end of the 17 teens, the Bahamas were taken back by the British government, and the pirate stronghold down there was eliminated, and by 1726 there were hardly any pirates left. They had been beaten down by the society from which they had profited for so long.
Yeah, and there's a whole different kind of pirate out there now, I guess. But let's talk about some of these older ones here. I wanted to get you on to talk about Henry Morgan as well. Is he the one that they named the Captain Morgan rum after?
Yes.
All right. How did that come about?
He's more famous for that than he is for what he actually did in his life. He would get a big kick out of it if he could come back and see what had happened, because Henry Morgan was a hard-charging, raucous kind of fellow. He also was an alcoholic, and he died from complications due to basically drinking too much and having too wild of a life. So I think he would appreciate the fact that his face
Well, he
or
must
a
have,
characterization of him is on a rum bottle.
he must have been drinking that Captain Morgan, I guess, right? Like,
Yeah.
is there any? I mean, was he drinking rum? Is there any actual facts that maybe they're using the same recipe he did?
Oh no, I don't think that. I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, that'd be great, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I don't think that they would have a recipe back then, but definitely rum was on the menu back then. That was one of the main drinks, especially in the Caribbean when we started having the sugar plantations and molasses and all that sort of stuff. So I don't know if they got their recipe from that era. I think they just used his reputation, and again the fact that people are so fascinated by pirates. You can just slap a pirate on almost anything and it becomes attractive to a large part of the purchasing.
Yeah, well, you have
audience.
the skull and bones flag, right? Was that a real flag that they used, or is that just something that we've made up?
No, we didn't make it up. The pirate's flag, the Jolly Roger as they call it, that started in the early 1700s. I think the earliest record of one is about 1701, but it really, again, was in the 17 teens that pirates had these personal ensigns or pennants that they would fly, and some of them did have skull and crossbones. A lot of them did. I mean, the skull and the skeleton represented death, so that was what they wanted to get across. The whole purpose of the pirate flag was to advertise who you were. Because if you're out in the ocean and a ship's coming towards you, you don't know necessarily who they are unless there's some characteristics or things that you could point to. So what would happen is when a pirate approached a merchant vessel, they usually would try to use a false flag. Like they may raise the Union Jack to appear as nothing more than a British ship, and then when they get close in, they haul down the Union Jack, and up goes the pirate flag, and that signals to the merchant ship that you're dealing with a pirate. You better decide really quickly what you're going to do. If you're going to fight, there's going to be a really bad fight coming your way. But if you surrender, maybe you'll be treated well, and all that will happen is all your cargo will be taken, and maybe your vessel will be taken, and you'll be placed on another ship or placed on a nearby piece of land. So the pirate flag was the pirate's calling card, and we do know because of descriptions what a lot of these pirate flags look like. Edward Lowe, who's this particularly nasty pirate, had a pirate flag that was a skeleton which represented death, and then one hand was raised aloft and was holding an hourglass, which represents the idea that your time is fast running out. To make a decision, you better choose wisely whether to fight or surrender. And on the other hand, there was a harpoon or dart that was piercing a heart, and from it 3 drops of blood were dripping, which is another representation of death. And what's interesting about Edward Lowe and his flag is we have contemporary newspaper accounts that describe in great detail that flag. Most people who have written about the era of pirates say that that's the same flag that Blackbeard had. But unfortunately, there's no contemporary evidence pointing to exactly what Blackbeard's flag looked like. So my guess is that it might not have been the same, but perhaps it had a skeleton on it, maybe had a cutlass raised. So there are a lot of different images. But yes, the pirate flag is real. What's really unfortunate is that there's not a single pirate flag from the golden age of piracy that is known. There is a pirate flag that a museum in Finland has from the early 1800s that has a skull and crossbones, and I have a picture of that in the book. But if any of your listeners are at a yard sale or an antique shop or any place or in the attic of their parents' or grandparents' house, and they find rolled up what looks like a really old pirate's flag, contact Antiques Roadshow, because if you find a real pirate's flag, that'll be worth a huge amount of money.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you that if they had any of those flags left over from those days. I bet you there's one hidden away somewhere. Somebody's whose great great grandfather was a pirate or something. It's hidden in a chest somewhere in the attic, right? It's got to be.
Could be, yeah.
Probably went out there somewhere. So getting back to Henry Morgan, what is he best known for other than the Captain Morgan? Like, if I was making rum and I'm gonna name it after a pirate, why would I choose him other than he was a big drinker?
Well, he arrives in Jamaica in about 1655, and you have to think about what the Caribbean was like. It was sort of like the Wild West on the ocean. There were a lot of buccaneers around, which are sort of pirates by another name, and England had their colony on Jamaica, and the governor there was trying to protect his colony as best he could, but the English government didn't send him much in the way of military support or naval support. So what the governors of Jamaica did is they developed alliances with some of the local buccaneers who happened to hate the Spanish government and Spaniards in particular. And of course, England and Spain were, for centuries, had been enemies. So the governors of Jamaica made a pact with some of the buccaneers. They said, you can come to Jamaica, you can come to Port Royal, you can operate out of this port, we will not bother you. You could spend your money here in the brothels and the grog shops or whatever. But in return, we ask that you go out and attack Spanish shipping, which is what the buccaneers wanted to do anyway. And when you come back, by the way, you need to give a certain percentage of whatever loot you get. You have to share it with the Jamaican government. So everybody made out from their perspective, and along comes Henry Morgan, and he in the 1660s. He gets a privateering license. They're not really privateers because at the time, England and Spain are not officially at war. That creates some problems, but that was pretty common back then. And the thing that he's most famous for, in 1671, he took a pretty big armada. They landed on the Isthmus of Panama. They traveled across the isthmus to Panama City, and they sacked the city. Unfortunately for Morgan and his men, the Spanish governor of Panama City had been tipped off that they were coming. So he was able to load a lot of the riches of the city onto ships, and they left before Morgan arrived. But some were still there, and there still was a lot of money in the city. Making it more difficult for Morgan to get it, however, was that the governor had ordered the city to be burned as soon as Morgan arrived, and it was. So he and his men spent a couple of weeks sifting through the ashes, and they were able to find a lot of jewels, a lot of gold, and they became quite rich, brought back and shared it with the governor of Jamaica, who was really happy for a little while, but the problem was England and Spain had become, they had signed a treaty of friendship right after Morgan left Port Royal. So at the time that he left, they were, sort of nominally at war, but while he was away, peace was signed. So Spain viewed Morgan's activities as nothing less than piracy, and King Charles II decided that to make nice with Spain, somebody's head had to roll. So the governor of Jamaica was hauled back to London, put in the Tower of London, and then a few months later, Morgan was hauled back to London and arrested for attacking this Spanish outpost. But what happens? Charles II, the King of England, was also known as the Merry Monarch. He was a hard-drinking, sort of bawdy guy himself, and he found Morgan to be a what's the word? sort of one of his, he saw himself reflected in Morgan. They got along, excuse the pun, royally, drinking and swapping stories. And in the end, everything was forgiven. Morgan was forgiven. The governor of Jamaica was let out of the Tower of London. And it's basically because money covers all sorts of sins. Morgan had brought a lot of money to Jamaica and to the English coffers. And then the king actually made Morgan the governor of Jamaica, sent him back there to root out all the pirates, all the buccaneers.
Oh, wow.
He had a tough time doing that, but then he drunk himself to death, and I think it was in 1688 that he finally died of the result of too wild of a life. But I want to go back for 1 second just to make clear that the reason that Panama City was a target and the reason that the Spanish were a target at this time of almost all buccaneers and later pirates is that because Spain had ruthlessly crushed the Incas and the Aztecs in Central and South America and had forced these subjugated native peoples to work the mines, the silver and the gold mines. So in the late 1500s and the 1600s and into the 1700s, a huge flood of gold and silver, both bullion, ingots, and coins like pieces of 8 and gold doubloons were streaming out of Central and South America on Spanish ships, going to the Philippines on the Pacific side and going back to Spain on the Atlantic side. And that created a natural focal point and magnet for piratical activity. And that's what the pirates were after. They were after these heavily laden treasure ships. I can't remember who it was in the 1950s. A bank robber got caught, and they asked him, "Why do you rob the banks?" And he said, "Because that's where the money is." Well, it's the same thing that pirates did. They went to where they thought the money would be, and Spanish treasure ships were a great target for many, many decades.
All right. Well, let me give a shout out real quick to everybody in the chat. We got quite a few people joining us from Australia. I see Paul Beska and Sapphire Elf is with us. It seems we have a little bit of a love affair going on in the chat room between Blue Chicken and Pink Chicken. I would imagine in the coming weeks we're going to have Baby Chicken in here as well. So just want to say hi to Johnny Dazzles. Make sure you guys are hitting that like button because it really helps us with the algorithm. So moving on from Captain Morgan, I suppose, let's talk a little bit about Captain William Kidd. Now, I don't suppose that this is Billy the Kid survived and
No.
and decided to be a pirate. Captain William Kidd is his own guy. You want to tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, William Kidd again is in the era roughly before 1700. He might have been a privateer for a little while. He was a mariner, and when King William's War came about, he was living in New York. He had married a wealthy widow. He wanted to go back to sea, so he went to London hoping to get a position in the English Navy. He didn't get that, but through some connections, they offered him something different. As I mentioned before, England was at war with France. So what the king did and what these powerful people did is they gave William Kidd 2 different commissions. One commission was to go into the Indian Ocean and to attack pirates there, because England was really upset with these Red Sea men who were operating in the Indian Ocean because they were attacking the Mughal ships, and the Mughal Empire was critical to the English East India Company, which was a bulwark of the English economy. And the Emperor Aurangzeb of the Mughal Empire would shut down trade after these pirates would attack, and that devastated the East India Company's bottom line, which in turn crippled England's finances. So they had a built-in interest in getting rid of pirates. So one thing that William Kidd was asked to do, he got this commission to be a privateer, essentially, to go to the Indian Ocean and to attack pirates. But since they were at war with France, since England was at war with France, they said, hey, let's give this guy, William Kidd, a second commission where he can act as a privateer to attack French ships. Yeah, I misspoke before. He didn't get a privateering commission to attack pirates. He just got a special commission to attack pirates. Then he got a privateering commission to attack specifically French ships. So William Kidd goes back to New York. He gets a crew together. A lot of the crewmen are former pirates. And because they're acting as privateers, it's no prey, no pay. So if they don't catch somebody, they don't get paid. So they go into the Indian Ocean, and for many, many months, William Kidd and his men are having no luck finding either the French or pirates. So slowly, but inevitably, William Kidd veers into piracy. He decides to attack Mughal shipping, and he goes up to the mouth of the Red Sea and tries to attack some Mughal ships there, but is beaten off by a English military vessel, a frigate, and then they go over to the Indian subcontinent and they attack a few small ships, take stuff from them, and become small-time petty pirates. But his claim to fame in the Indian Ocean is that he attacked a couple of large Indian ships that had a lot of money on board. He claimed that they were legitimate targets because they had French passes, but the truth was they were both Indian ships. They just happened to have French passes because everybody who was on the ocean at that time had false, not only false flags, but false papers to basically tell somebody else that they could be anything from a Dutch ship to a French ship to an English ship, depending on who was attacking them and what identity would get them out of trouble. So he was attacking these Indian ships. The emperor got upset again with the English. The East India Company suffered. There was a major manhunt launched to find William Kidd, and by the time, to make a long story a little shorter, by the time he goes back into the Atlantic, down to the Caribbean, and then up to Long Island, he finds out that people are searching for him because he's a pirate, and he goes back to one of his former investors, Governor Bellamont of New York and Massachusetts, which were together at the time, tries to get some protection, but Governor Bellamont knows that there's that the King of England wants William Kidd's head, basically, so they send him back to London, where he languishes in jail for the better part of a year. They finally have a trial. They find him guilty of murder because he had killed one of his crewmen, but also of piracy. And those French passes that he thought would get him off mysteriously disappeared. But even if they had been there, they might have gotten him off from being prosecuted for attacking the Indian ships, since they appeared to be French ships. But he also committed some other minor acts of piracy that were pretty clear. So they find him guilty. William Kidd tries to negotiate with the English government, saying, hey, I left lots of money, 30,000, 40,000 pounds worth of money down in the Caribbean. If you let me out of jail and give me a ship, I'll go down there, I'll get the money for you, and I'll bring it back. Well, they don't bite on that because they had actually already sent ships down to the Caribbean to look for his supposed treasure because he had let slip where it might be laying, and they didn't find anything. So William Kidd, the morning of his execution, he gets rip-roaring drunk, which is quite common, and he's brought to execution dock. They put the noose around his neck. They pull away the board beneath him. He drops precipitously and hits the ground because the rope broke. So he was suddenly brought out of his drunken stupor, and he begged for forgiveness, which he hadn't done before, but no forgiveness was there for William Kidd. The noose, a new noose was called up, a new length of rope. They wrapped it around his neck again. They tried a second time, and this time the rope held. and William Kidd went off into eternity. And what they did with his body afterwards is kind of gruesome. The English government wanted to have a symbol that could scare either pirates or would-be pirates from pursuing that type of life. So they took William Kidd's body, they slathered it in tar, then they put it in a iron cage, hung it from a gibbet at the mouth of the Thames River, where, according to contemporary sources, it remained there for many, many years, slowly decaying and with birds probably eating it at various points. But it stayed there as a sign and a symbol, be careful what you do, because if you become a pirate, this is what might happen to you.
Yeah, wow, that's crazy. I mean, it kind of sounds like something Vlad the Impaler would do. Poor Captain Kidd, right?
And I have to add something here. It's kind of interesting. I live in Marblehead, Massachusetts. There are a lot of people who have written books who claim that William Kidd was totally railroaded and that he was not a pirate at all, and it was just a vendetta on the part of the English government, and they just needed somebody to sacrifice to make the emperor of the Mughal emperor happy, and so that trade could resume between India and the East India Company. Well, those books, a lot of them are quite good, and they have persuasive arguments. I just happen to disagree. But the reason I mentioned that I live in Marblehead is there's a Scottish gentleman who lives in my town who used to be the editor of the largest Scottish newspaper, and he is a William Kidd fanatic, and he believes very strongly that William Kidd was railroaded, and he's been spearheading an effort in recent years to get a statue to William Kidd back in where does he want? I don't remember what town he wants it in, but back in Scotland, and because William Kidd was Scottish, and he wants to get a formal pardon issued by the British government. I think the Queen has to do it to exonerate William Kidd, and he's doing all that now. I don't know where it stands.
Yeah, I wonder how that'll work out, huh?
I don't think it's going to happen, but who knows?
Now, do any of these pirates that we're talking about, do any of them have living family today that you know of?
Yeah, well, some of them do, and this is another sort of mysterious area. After I wrote the book, I went out and I probably gave 60 or 70 talks all over mainly the East Coast, a couple on the West Coast. And after my talks, people will come up, hopefully buy a copy and chat with me. And at least two people at two different talks came up to me and swore that according to their family lore, they are descendants of Blackbeard. There's no evidence that Blackbeard had any kids. I don't know how you prove that, but maybe it's true. There are also people that claim to be descendants of Sam Bellamy, for example, the wit of fame and the treasure that went down off Cape Cod. And I'm sure that there are other pirates, certainly Red Sea pirates, who survived, who weren't hanged. They came back to their communities, and they had children, many of them. So there must be many people that are alive today. If they've done their genealogy, they can trace their roots back to some or another pirate back then. But for the really famous pirates that most people have heard about, I don't know a lot about their descendants. Stede Bonnet, for example, which we might talk about, he had a couple of kids. Maybe they got married and had kids, and it's gone down the generations. So there are people out there who can claim that they're descended from pirates. I know that. But I didn't really write about that in the book, and I don't have the specifics on who they might be or where they might be. Another person came to one of my talks and told me he was a descendant of William Kidd, and that may or may not be true, because William Kidd did have a daughter, Sarah, and she survived. I don't remember if she had kids, though.
Yeah, it's just incredible. I mean, I would love to have like a great grandfather as a pirate or something. I think that'd be awesome. So let's talk about Steve Bonnet a little bit. I guess just to let everybody know, I have 6 names on the list here of pirates to talk about today. We're down to 3 left, and Steve Bonnet is one of them. So you mentioned it. Who is he?
Well, Stede Bonnet was a wealthy sugar plantation owner in Barbados in the early 1700s, 17 teens. And about 1717, he decided to become a pirate. And it was a strange decision because, as I said, most pirates came from the lower echelons of society. And here's Stede Bonnet, a fairly wealthy, well-bred, educated individual.
Yeah,
decides.
You think he would have like the best ship of all, right?
Yeah, well, that's part of the story. He decided to become a pirate. We don't know exactly why. Some of the contemporary accounts say that he might have gone insane or a little nuts. Other people say that it was because he wasn't getting along too well with his wife, I guess, and he decided to leave the marriage in a most dramatic way. But since Stede Bonnet was a man of means, he built his own pirate ship. He built a sloop, probably about 70 feet long, 60 or 70 feet long, and then, unlike other pirates who are the incentive for pirates to become pirates is that they get to share in the profits of any ships that are plundered. They didn't get paid up front, but Stede Bonnet needed a crew, so he basically offered salaries to these people to join him in piracy, and he left Barbados. He had a couple of captures. He didn't really know much about sailing. One of the neat things about his ship is in the captain's cabin, he had built-in bookcases because he brought along his private library, at least part of it, thinking that he would have time to read, I guess, during his leisure or downtime. But Stede Bonnet had some success, but he also had some noted failures. He relied heavily on the people that were on board to sail the ship because that was not his forte. And then he tangled with a rather large Spanish ship that nearly destroyed his sloop, the Revenge. After that entanglement, he went to Nassau, and there he met Blackbeard. And Blackbeard liked Stede Bonnet's ship. So Blackbeard convinced Stede Bonnet to join forces to give Blackbeard the captaincy of the Revenge and just relax in the captain's cabin while Blackbeard took the ship and was a pirate. Don't worry, Stede, because Stede Bonnet was injured. And he said, basically, nurse your injuries, get better. We'll go out pirating. I'll run the ship. Don't worry. So Stede Bonnet apparently agreed to this. They went out, and this is the beginning of Blackbeard's reign and him gathering more and more ships. Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard hung together for quite a few months, and Stede Bonnet got better. One of the ships they captured was better than the Revenge, so Blackbeard took that one and put Stede Bonnet back in charge of his ship, the Revenge. Then they split apart, and how do I describe this? They split apart, and then ultimately they both ended up in North Carolina. They came back together. They ended up in North Carolina, and both of them Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet professed a desire to get a king's pardon for their piracy, which was available at the time, and become honest men. Stede Bonnet was the first one after Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet went into Beaufort Inlet. Stede Bonnet went over to Bath, North Carolina, talked to the governor, get his pardon. By the time he came back, Blackbeard had left with all the money, and all the men were gone, and Stede Bonnet was furious. For a little while, he tried to be a non-pirate. after getting the pardon. But Stede Bonnet slowly fell into his old ways. He engaged in some piracy. North Carolina officials were very upset with his depredations, so they sent out this guy, Colonel William Rhett, on a ship to go track down Stede Bonnet. They had a running battle on Cape Fear River. Stede Bonnet and his men were captured. Many of them were killed. They were brought back to Charleston, South Carolina, where they were tried. Stede Bonnet had some fans in Charleston. Other wealthy individuals in Charleston said, "Hey, Judge, you can't sentence Stede Bonnet to being hanged. He's like us. He's a formerly rich guy. He's an aristocrat. He's well educated. He's not a rabble like these other pirates. You can't find him guilty and have him hanged." But the judge was a rather stern individual who decided to follow the law, found Stede Bonnet guilty of piracy and many of his men, and ultimately Stede Bonnet and 19 of his crew were hanged on the edge of the harbor in Charleston.
Wow.
So that was a bad end for Stede Bonnet. Made a bad decision.
And all the guy wanted to do was get away from his wife.
Yeah. It must have been a really bad marriage.
She must have been like, I mean, how bad must a wife be? Like, you're like, oh, I'm gonna go hang out with Blackbeard and all the pirates because they're so much nicer to me than you. What a horrible wife.
It's horrible.
All right, so I've got a question in here, and it's a good one from Johnny Dazzle. He wants to know, I guess he was watching on a documentary that the eye patch, like some of these pirates will have an eye patch over their eye. Mm-hmm. Would they have an eye patch over their eye to keep one eye kind of used to the dark, so that when they race down below deck, that they could just swap eye patches and their eye would automatically be used to seeing in the dark, so to speak? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I've read that. I've seen that reference. I was not able to find any evidence that is actually happened. Just think about it. Your eyes normalize, acclimatize, or deal with different light levels relatively quickly. And you might be at a disadvantage, especially with respect to depth perception, if you kept a patch over one eye all the time. So I'm not buying it, but I've heard that before. But I will say that there were some pirates who had real eye patches because pirates sometimes lost eyes, lost limbs. And one of the fascinating things about the Pirates Code and the articles that pirates signed is it had one of the earliest forms of workman's compensation. Written into these codes were sentences like, if you lose an arm or a leg, you are awarded 300 pieces of 8. And we also learned that lefties, I'm a lefty, I'm mostly lefty, I do different things with different hands, but we learned that even back then, lefties were discriminated against because if you lost your right arm, you may get 300 pieces of 8. But if you lost your left arm, you only got 150 pieces of 8. So
right.
There were eye patches. Another thing I have to mention, because people always bring it up, are peg legs or wooden legs, or hooks like Captain Hook. Okay, back then, even before the 1600s, there were prosthetic arms and hands and legs. They were made out of wood. Sometimes there was a claw-like thing for your hand, so you could at least grab things roughly. That was real, but there's not a single record of any pirate having a claw for a hand or a wooden leg. And think about it. You're out in the ocean on a rolling ship where you have to perform a lot of duties that require some degree of nimbleness and being able to get around. Having a wooden leg would be a major disadvantage. So while I don't doubt that there were some pirates who might have had their legs blown off and later in life had a wooden leg, my guess is that once that happened and they got their workman's compensation, they were let off at the nearest port or they didn't remain pirates for very long.
Yeah, and how would they be able to, like, if you were on a pirate ship and you lost half your leg? I wouldn't imagine they had the greatest medical care for you. It's not like all these pirate ships had their own doctor, right?
Right. No, some pirate ships did have doctors, and if you did have a doctor, but you have to keep in mind, back then a doctor was different than what we think about a doctor today.
Well,
back
yeah,
then
that's
it was much like art is science, and it was not too far removed from witch doctor stuff. They didn't have a lot of things that they could do, and they didn't know a lot of reasons for diseases. But when it came to amputating somebody's legs, it was very rough, and it often killed the person, or amputating an arm. But there were doctors on board some pirate ships, and in honor or to reflect their sort of heightened status, they would get a little bit more of the profits from ships that were plundered. While it's true that the booty was distributed almost evenly, there were a couple of people that were a little bit higher than your average crewman. Your average crewman might get one share. The quartermaster might get 1.5 or 2 shares. The doctor might get 2 shares. And the captain, whoever that was at the time, would get 2 shares. So it wasn't a totally equal, but it was pretty darn close.
Yeah. All right. Well, I suppose we've got about 25 minutes left or so we're right on schedule. Moving right along. Sam Bellamy. What can you tell us about
Sam
him?
Bellamy. Well, Sam Bellamy, I live in Massachusetts. A lot of people around here know Sam Bellamy, but a lot of people around the world do because of what happened to him in the end. We don't know a lot about his early life, which is a common refrain for many of these pirates, but at about 1715, he shows up in Cape Cod, where he's a fisherman, and he and another guy, Palsgrave Williams, who's actually a relatively wealthy individual from Newport, decide that they're going to go down to right off Vero Beach in Florida, because something very important happened there in the history of piracy. In the summer of 1715, a treasure fleet of ships heading from Central America to Spain, and these ships were full of money and jewels, and a hurricane struck. And I think it was 13 or 14 out of 15 ships sank to the bottom of the ocean, only a couple of miles off where Vero Beach, Florida is today. So it wasn't very deep. It was less than a couple of miles. It wasn't very deep. And news of this sinking and all of that treasure being strewn on the ocean floor radiated outwards in the Atlantic world and brought a lot of treasure seekers down to this area to dive on the wrecks. It also brought the Spanish government that tried to fight off these treasure seekers. So some people, like Bellamy and Williams, went down there trying to get some of the money. They were unsuccessful, as far as we know. A few people were successful. But what happened is so many people went down there to dive on the wrecks, and so many of them were unsuccessful. But they were already in the Caribbean. They already had this money lust within them. So they decided, hey, piracy's taking off again. Why don't we just become pirates? And that's what Bellamy and Williams decided. So I'll leave Williams aside for a little bit, or for most of this. I'll just focus on Bellamy. And Williams was with them most of the time. They went off and they captured about 50 ships, but then they struck it rich. They captured a ship called the Witta, which was a British slave ship. But fortunately for Bellamy and Williams, the Witta had recently, right before they came upon it, had been to Port Royal, Jamaica, one of the biggest slave marts in the Caribbean. And they had sold 500 slaves from Africa.
Wow.
In return for that, they get a lot of gold dust, gold coins, and pieces of 8. So those were all on board the Witta. So when Bellamy and Williams captured the Witta, they suddenly had maybe 20 to 30,000 pounds sterling worth of treasure, if not more. So, and they added to that all the 50 ships they had attacked the previous year. So they were sitting pretty, and they decided to go north. The plan was actually to go all the way to Maine, where they were going to careen the ships, clean them, and decide what to do next. Some people say that Bellamy wanted to go back to Cape Cod, where he had a girlfriend, Mary Hallett, but I don't think there's any truth to that story, because we have testimony from some of his pirates who got off the ship before. I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. The ship ultimately sinks, but that said that the plan was to go to Maine, not to go to Cape Cod. But while Bellamy and the Witta were off of the elbow of Cape Cod in April of 1717, a nor'easter comes barreling down the coast. Bad weather. It's like a cold weather hurricane comes barreling down the coast, and the Witta sank off of roughly where Eastham on the Cape is today, about 1,000, maybe 1,500 feet offshore, where Marconi Beach is today. If any of your listeners have been to the Cape Cod, Marconi Beach, where the first wireless telegraphy took place in the United States. But anyway, so the Witta sank, and down to the bottom of the ocean, and not very deep, went the ship, and 160 pirates died. And the Massachusetts government sent some people out, and they wanted to retrieve all that money because there were two survivors. They weren't able to find the money, and for hundreds of years, people were looking for all that treasure that went down with the Witta. And it wasn't until 1984 that a salvager and amateur historian, a guy named Barry Clifford, using high-tech equipment, he found the remains of the Witta. And over many years, going through the present, they've been pulling out of the water this big stash of money that was on the Witta. And there's a wonderful museum called the Witta Pirate Museum, which is in, where is it, West Yarmouth, I think, West Yarmouth on the Cape. And if you're ever up there, go visit it. It's well worth a visit. And you can see displays of gold doubloons and pieces of eight, and they've pulled up certainly many millions of dollars worth of treasure. And to date, he hasn't sold any of it. He had a bunch of investors, but they haven't sold any of it. And recently there was a big news story. I don't know where it stands right now, but let me back up. When you have a ship that sank into the sand hundreds of years ago with all this gold and silver, a lot of the materials of the ship, both the wood and many of the men who died, their bones and the silver and gold, form these concretions with sand. They're like huge pieces of conglomerate made up of all different things. And they've been pulling these out of the ocean, and they have archaeologists and other people who are gently going through these concretions, taking them apart and seeing what's within. And not too long ago, they found a number of bones, which they surmise are some of the pirates who went down. And I think they're doing DNA analysis right now to try to figure out who those people might be and if they have ancestors. So that's kind of neat.
Wow. You wonder if they're giving any of the gold to the ancestors, right? Probably not.
My guess is no.
Yes, I would guess no, too. So I actually have another question in here for you. Johnny Dazzles asked another one. Any pirate stories of sea monsters or UFOs, etc., or ships with special powers?
None that I came across. There's, on ships, they can see St. Elmo's fire, which is sort of I'm not really sure what it is, static electricity or just electricity in the air, and sometimes the masts get a bluish tint to them, and there's something mystical about them. I have no doubt that if we had better records, again, keep in mind, pirates didn't write memoirs. We don't have day-to-day documentation. They didn't keep journals like regular mariners did, merchant mariners, Navy ships, logs, yeah. So, however, their peers and people in the 1600s and 1700s did see a lot of strange things at sea. There were still beliefs in krakens and these huge animals that are out there. And if you look at old maps, you can see that they often have these monstrous kinds of things that are unknown to us today. So I have no doubt that some pirates saw strange things while they were out at sea, and maybe they attributed it to something that was otherworldly, or just didn't understand what they were seeing. But I didn't run across any characters. There are no black pearls out there going down to Davy Jones' locker. And what's the name now? Was it the Black Pearl in the Pirates of the Caribbean movie? When
I think it was the Black Pearl.
They came back with all the dead people on it, right? And I don't think that kind of stuff happened.
All right. What about mermaids?
Mermaids, that's an interesting story. I don't know a huge amount about mermaids, but they run through history a lot. And some people think that mermaids were just dugongs or manatees that were seen in the light of the moon, and people's imagination took off. But let me come at it a different way. If there really were mermaids, don't you think by now we would have seen them? Just like if Megalodon was still around, if you saw The Deep with Jason Statham, which is an awesome movie. But if there was a Megalodon, if there was a 50, 60-foot shark living beneath a thermocline in the Marianas Trench, which isn't there anyway, don't you think we would have seen them by now? So I'm not a big believer in mermaids.
No? Well, you never know, I suppose, right? They could be out there somewhere.
I would love it if somebody found a mermaid. For the same reason, I think it would be fascinating if they found the Loch Ness Monster.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. The Loch Ness Monster is probably dead now, right?
Yeah, if it was ever alive. But
now, are there any of their ships still around, or any of these vessels still around anywhere today? Any of them?
No, the remains of there's some boards or pieces of wood that they found and cannons with the Witta. But think about it. This is the era of the Great Age of Sail. These are wooden ships, and they're subject to rot and marine worms and just the ravages of age. Think about this. This is another way to think about it. I wrote a book on whaling called Leviathan, the history of whaling in America. At one time, there were, close to 800 American whaling ships, all like the Charles Morgan, which is at Mystic Seaport. There were over, a century, there were well over 1,000 whaling ships. The only one that survived is the Charles W. Morgan, and the only reason that it survived is because a rich guy in New Bedford in the 1920s decided to put it in dry dock and save it. So these things don't last. I mean, the gold and silver coins, if you find them in the ocean, they last.
Yeah, there's
but
just
the
be a pile of
ships
coins down there.
No. That would be cool if we had, still had a pirate ship.
Well, some of these these mermaid tales, even if we did hear, is it true that they made their sails out of hemp?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that was used back then. I think it was hemp and cotton and duck fabric. But, yeah, I think hemp is today you can get hemp shirts and sheets, I'm sure.
You got to wonder if they were growing hemp for their sails, what were they doing? What were they doing with the rest of the plant, right? With all the rum and hemp that they had laying around. You got to wonder if maybe they weren't seeing mermaids.
That could be. I don't actually know the history of marijuana. I don't know how long ago people realized it's not psychotic. What's the word?
Psychedelic.
Its qualities, ability to change your perception. I wonder. I don't know how far back that goes.
Yeah. Well, it's been around for a while. I think the Indians were smoking it in their peace pipe, weren't they?
I don't think that was. was that marijuana or peyote or mushrooms? They were doing other stuff. Yeah, there have been drugs around for
Smoking
forever.
The Indians, they were all into that, all into those psychedelic drugs. All right,
Yeah.
so I guess we got about 10 minutes. Who is Edward Lowe?
Oh, Edward Lowe. This is funny. Funny, but when the book came out, I did a lot of radio interviews and also at talks. I would always get asked this question: who's my favorite pirate? And I would have to rephrase it because favorite sort of implies liking. These guys, I'd love to have a drink with some of these guys just to pick their brains, but
They
they're
wouldn't
pretty
beat you up
miserable.
first.
They're pretty miserable individuals. But the one that I found the most fascinating was Edward Lowe, just because I think he was psychotic. He was one of the meanest, nastiest pirates you could imagine. One of his signature moves was to cut the lips and ears off of the people that he captured and roast them and force them to eat their own flesh before he ran them through with his cutlass.
Oh my God!
One time he caught a Spanish ship that had had a bag of gold and silver on board, and the captain of the ship had tied this bag to a rope. And it was over the side of the ship, apparently. I guess he knew the handwriting on the wall. And when the pirates came on board, he cut the rope so the bag of money went into the ocean instead of into the pirates' hands. But unfortunately for that captain, somebody on the ship told Edward Lowe what had happened. Edward Lowe and his men were so upset that they killed the captain and then all 38 members of his crew. So he was just a nasty guy. He wasn't particularly successful. He captured a number of ships, didn't succeed in gathering any large amount of money. But one of the things that he's most remembered for is he was like American enemy number one, most wanted. And this guy Peter Solgaard, who was a captain of a British warship called the Greyhound, was in search of Lowe and his compatriot Charles Harris, who was on another ship. And he found him off the coast, not too far from around Rhode Island. And there was this battle, but Solgaard went after Harris's ship because he thought that was Lowe's ship because it was the larger and more powerful of the two. But it wasn't, and Lowe showed his true character. Instead of coming to the aid of his fellow pirate, it was actually his sort of lieutenant. They had been Lowe had given Charles Harris this ship after they had captured another vessel. Instead of coming to the aid of Charles Harris, Lowe and his men on their ship just took off. And Harris was captured by the Greyhound, brought into Newport, Rhode Island, and ultimately, after a trial, 23 of the pirates that had formerly been part of Lowe's fleet were found guilty and hanged right there in Newport, the largest hanging until the mid-1800s. There was another large hanging. It's escaping me. I talk about it in the book, but I'm forgetting what it was. I think it's had something to do with slavery, though. But anyway, there was so Lowe escaped, and what really happened to him, we don't know. He attacked a number of fishing vessels off Nova Scotia, and then, depending on which history you believe, he either was marooned by his men because he had become too wild and crazy. Another story has it that he killed his quartermaster, and again, the men decided to maroon him or send him off on a boat because he could no longer be trusted. And then there's one other story that comes from a French source, which is basically that a French ship captured Lowe and his men, and I think ultimately he was hanged someplace. So I don't know what happened to him. We don't really know exactly, but he had a short, bloody career. And the reason he's most interesting to me is, again, I live in Marblehead. One of the fishing ships that he captured off Nova Scotia had a bunch of Marblehead men on board, and he tried to get a bunch of them to sign on to become pirates. This one guy, Philip Ashton, refused to become a pirate, And when they were down in the Bay of Honduras, when Philip Ashton was on Lowe's ship down in the Bay of Honduras, he went to a local uninhabited island called Roatan with other men on the ship to get water. And while he was there, he ran into the brush and basically escaped. They tried to look for him for a while, but then they took off. And Philip Ashton lived on that island for almost 2 years, uninhabited island, by himself until he was rescued by an American ship who came by the island. And Philip Ashton, when he got back to Marblehead, with the help of the local minister, there was a book written about his travails living alone for nearly 2 years. And keep in mind, this is right after Daniel Defoe had written the book Robinson Crusoe. And here this guy, Philip Ashton, was America's very own Robinson Crusoe. So it was a very popular book. And it's kind of neat just because it's in my hometown that part of the story transpired.
Yeah, there certainly are an interesting amount of stories that come out of that Massachusetts area. I see Dark Hours in here. He's all excited. We're talking about Marblehead, Massachusetts. He's like, all right. Let me ask you a question. Did pirates have any special weapons that only pirates had? I was reading here. Let me see here. I'm looking for the... Oh, here we go. Sapphire Elf says, my blacksmith friend showed me a boarding axe. It's an axe with an eyelet for a rope on the head so you can slam into the side of a wooden ship from a skiff to stay alongside it. Did they have like their own special weapons?
I'm not aware of any, but think about it. They didn't have foundries. There weren't blacksmiths on board pirate ships. They basically took from their surrounding environment, and that included armaments. So I think almost all the armaments that pirates would have had at the time would have been ones that you would see on other ships. I mean, cutlasses, matchlock, pistols, sometimes muskets, but that was more unusual. Their biggest weapon were cannons, and they were relatively small because these ships were not that large. They would have 4-pound, 6-pound cannons, swivel guns. And 4-pound, 6-pound, that's the weight of the ball that comes out of the cannon, not the weight of the cannon.
That's another question for you. I mean, how many hits from a cannon can a ship take before it sinks? I mean, you think just one cannonball would put a hole in the ship and sink it, right?
No. It depends on how far you are when you're firing. It depends on how heavy the ball is, and it depends on how thick and strong the planking is on the ship you're trying to attack or sink. Some of these ships, a lot of them were made out of very tough oak, sometimes live oak, and as a result, if you had a 4-pound or 6-pound cannon and you were quite a ways off, I mean, there's only a certain amount, the trajectory and the length you can propel these balls. You can't shoot them for miles and miles. You have to be within hundreds of feet or hundreds of yards to even score a hit, and then you're bobbing in the ocean, so you have to have good aim. So it wasn't all that common for cannonballs to go clear through the hull below the waterline and into the ship, although it did happen. I just finished a book. My next book's on privateering, which some people might be interested in because it's related to piracy, sort of, not really. I'm looking at privateering in the American Revolution, and there's one account that I talk about. There was a British warship that battled a relatively large privateer, American privateer, and the British captain got so enraged with the American privateer because he wouldn't immediately surrender to a much more powerful force after being strafed with some bullet fire and a couple of small cannons, that the British captain ordered his men to haul out the big guns, the 12 and 18-pound cannons that are huge, and he sent a couple of those over to the privateer ship, and those went clear through the hull of the ship, and the ship started sinking. So the British sailors had to put out their longboats, and they actually saved a lot of these privateers from drowning. So if you had a big cannon, or you were close and had a small cannon, and you weren't battling a ship that had especially thick timbers, yeah, you could cause some real damage to the hull.
All right. And what about singing pirates?
Sing, I don't know.
Did
Again,
they
they
sing
don't.
a lot? Did they have like their own songs?
I'm sure they sang a lot. I mean, we don't have. No, there's nothing written that says, oh, they sang a lot. But we do know that some pirates articles actually had little comments about the orchestra. There were orchestras, or at least people that could play instruments on board pirate ships, and they were supposed to play at certain times of day. And there's no doubt that pirates sang in the sense of shanties. Those have been around since forever while doing work, hauling up the anchor, whatever. So I'm sure there was singing, and especially when they got some rum into them, they must have been singing songs that were popular in the day. That was a very common thing that would happen in a bar. Why wouldn't it happen on a pirate ship? But I'd never read an account of a contemporary saying, hey, these pirates sang all night.
Yeah.
and
danced on the deck. If I would imagine pirates singing, it would be in a real deep voice, very angrily like.
Yeah. But I'm sure they did.
Full of anger. Well,
yeah.
Eric J. Dolan, it certainly is a pleasure having you on. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and we can get you back on for another show. Maybe we'll do a show on hurricanes or lighthouses or something. It definitely is a really interesting topic. I love the whole pirate ideas. I think I would be a really good pirate. What do you guys think? I think I could probably be the best pirate that there is if there are pirates out there today. I'd be a good one.
Can I add one other thing real quick?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, just because your listeners, if you're interested in learning more about this book or some of my other books, I do have a website, and the reason I mention it is my website, I have the first chapter of each one of my books on the website, so you can read to see what the general layout of the book is. And my website's very simple. It's www.ericjdolan, that's EricJaydolin, ericjdolan.com. And so if you're interested in any of these books, and the book that we're talking about today is Black Flags, Blue Waters, The Epic History of America's Most Notorious Pirates. You can get it anywhere. I will let you know that I just found out that on June 23rd, is it June 20? Yeah, around June 23rd or 24th, there's something called BookBub. I don't know if you know about it, but it's this company that basically has huge mailing lists, and they advertise deep discounts on ebooks. So I know that if you are a Kindle reader or a Nook reader or an iBook reader, around June 23rd for a couple of days, I think it's a week, Black Flags, Blue Waters will be on sale for $2.99. So I just found that out. So you can get a cheap version if you want to read the ebook, but the paperback's pretty cheap, and you still can get hardcovers. But anyway, I hope people, if they're interested in what they heard tonight and they want to keep a writer like me employed.
Well, I did spell your name wrong, didn't I? I don't know how I did that. I guess I was just going off of
Oh, you did AN probably. Everybody does that.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
I'll fix that as soon as we're off here. But I was going to ask you about your website link, and of course, it's in the description box below, guys. Go check it out. You can also find Eric J. Dolan on Facebook. He is a real, just look for Eric J. Dolan, and I think author will come up next to it. Just click on that, and it'll take you right to his Facebook author page. So I noticed you're not on Twitter, so.
No, I am on Twitter, but what I focus more on Facebook because the only reason I use social media is, I'm an older guy. It's not my natural environment, but the only reason I use it is to help connect with potential readers and to help my career. So my Facebook page, my author page, has about 16,000 followers, and most of what I post is either about nature, which I love, but also a lot of it's about my books or history topics. I have a personal Facebook page, which I hardly ever use, which only has about 500. I have like 500 friends. But Twitter, I started that, and I just found out whenever I post anything about history or about my book or about a talk that I was giving, I got no response. There was no traction, and it was just, I like Facebook better because I can actually write a couple of paragraphs and post an interesting picture. I have problems with other things about Facebook, but with respect to me as a writer and connecting with potential readers, I found that Facebook is very enjoyable because I get a lot of comments from people about my posts, and sometimes we get into conversations. So I am on Twitter, but I'm not very active on Twitter.
All right. So everybody get out there and buy Black Flags, Blue Waters by Eric J. Dolan. Everybody's into that, I mean, goodness, $2.99 for the Kindle. I mean, go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
Even if you don't read it, go buy the book and support Eric J. Dolan. Thank you very much for coming on, man. We certainly do appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate that.
All right.
Very much.
So hang on a minute, and I'll get right back to you in a minute as soon as I wrap this up here. Just want to let everybody know you can find us at www.conflictradio.net. You can find us on all of your podcast catchers, Apple iTunes, iHeartRadio. We're on Spreaker, and well, I guess my usual outing is very, fitting for today. Batten down the hatches.